Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the heart of an empire where the sun itself hangs by a thread, where smoke rises from 1,000,000 extinguished fires, and where silence falls across an entire civilization waiting to see if tomorrow will ever come. You're standing in the grand plaza of Tenochtitlan on a night in 1507, and every single flame in the Aztec Empire, from the humblest cook in fire to the sacred braziers atop the Great Pyramid, has just been snuffed out. The darkness is absolute. The air tastes like fear. Welcome to the new fire ceremony, perhaps the most anxiety-inducing sleepover the world has ever known. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, like why an entire civilization would willingly plunge itself into darkness and hold its collective breath for an entire night. So before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, or what time it is in your corner of the world. Maybe you're tucked in bed in Toronto, or perhaps you're winding down after a long day in Tokyo. I'd love to know. Now let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You're wrapped in a cotton cloak, standing among thousands of citizens in the city square. The year is Tenochtitlan, one rabbit in the Aztec calendar, and it marks the completion of a 52-year cycle called the Shumolpili, the binding of the years. To the Aztec people surrounding you, this night represents the most dangerous moment in all of existence. Their cosmology teaches that the universe has already been destroyed and recreated 4 times before. 4 previous suns have risen and fallen, 4 worlds have crumbled into oblivion, and tonight, the 5th sun, your sun, the one that has nourished humanity for generations, might choose to never rise again. The priests have been preparing for months. They've swept every temple, every home, every street. All old pottery has been smashed. Cooking stones have been thrown into the lake. Pregnant women have been locked indoors wearing masks of maguey leaves, because if the world ends tonight, the gods might transform them into jaguars that will devour what remains of humanity. Children huddle close to their parents, forbidden to sleep because legend warns that sleeping children might turn into mice if the sun fails to return. You can almost hear the collective heartbeat of an empire thrumming in the darkness. The priests are climbing now. You can't see them in the blackness, but you know they're ascending Tenochtitlan, the hill of the star, about 8 miles from the city centre. They carry one prisoner, a warrior captured specifically for this moment. The entire fate of the cosmos rests on what happens next. If the priest can successfully kindle a new fire by friction on this warrior's open chest, the universe will continue. The 5th sun will rise. Humanity will receive another 52 years. But if the fire won't catch, if the sticks fail to produce that crucial spark, then the Tzitsamim, the star demons that lurk at the edges of reality, will descend and devour every living thing. Historians still argue whether the Aztecs genuinely believe the world might end each cycle, or if the ritual served more as a massive social renewal ceremony, a way to literally and figuratively clear away the old and begin fresh. But standing here in the suffocating darkness, feeling the weight of collective dread pressing down like a physical force, the fear feels devastatingly real. The silence stretches, an hour passes, then another. You imagine the priests on that distant hilltop drilling their fire stick into the wooden board placed across the warrior's chest cavity. The friction must be perfect. The tinder must catch. One spark. That's all creation needs. One spark to keep the cosmic machinery grinding forward for another half-century. Then finally you see it, a distant pinprick of orange light on the hilltop. The fire has caught. The universe will continue. A sound erupts from the crowd around you, part sob, part scream, part laughter of relief. Runners with torches sprint down from the hill, and suddenly the city blazes back to life. Flames race from building to building, from temple to temple, from hearth to hearth. The priests relight the sacred fire at the top of Templo Mayor, and that divine flame spreads throughout Tenochtitlan like a circulatory system, pumping light back into the empire's heart. But here's the quirky detail that most people miss. Every household wasn't just relighting their old fires. They were receiving entirely new flames, descended from that one successful spark born on a sacrificial chest. Your cooking fire, your neighbour's warming fire, the baker's oven, the potter's kiln. All of them now share a mystical connection, all children of the same cosmic rebirth. For the next 52 years, every flame in the empire would be a distant relative of that single spark. Talk about keeping the home fires burning to an extreme level. The new fire ceremony wasn't just about fire, though. It represented a complete civilizational reset. All debts were forgiven. All grudges were theoretically set aside. The calendar wheels meshed back to their starting position, like the odometer on a cosmic vehicle rolling back to zero. People replaced their household items, bought new clothes if they could afford them, and recommitted themselves to their roles in society. It was New Year's Eve, Judgment Day, and a going-out-of-business sale all wrapped into one terrifying, exhilarating night. Spanish chroniclers who witnessed or heard accounts of the ceremony described it with fascinated horror. Bernardino de Sahagún, a Franciscan friar who arrived in Mexico shortly after the conquest, documented that people believed if the fire could not be drawn, then the sun would be destroyed forever, all would be ended, there would evermore be night. The Aztecs, he noted, were genuinely convinced that darkness might triumph permanently. The sacrifice atop the Hill of the Star was essential to the ritual's success. The warrior's chest became the altar where death and rebirth intersected. The priest would extract his heart in the traditional manner. We'll explore that technique in detail later, and then immediately kindle the new fire in the cavity left behind. Life from death, light from darkness, continuation from ending. The symbolism was as subtle as a pyramid to the face, but effective. And yet, despite the solemnity, there was something almost theatrical about it all. Can you imagine being the warrior chosen for this role? You'd spent your entire life training for combat, proving your worth on battlefield after battlefield, only to end up as cosmic kindling. Though to be fair, in Aztec society, being chosen for this particular sacrifice was considered an enormous honor. Your death wouldn't just feed the gods, it would literally save the universe. Your name would be remembered, your family would receive privileges, and your soul would bypass the difficult journey through the underworld, shooting straight up to the highest heaven where you'd spend eternity accompanying the sun on its daily journey across the sky. Not a bad retirement plan if you can get past the whole having your heart removed part. You're walking through the streets of Tenochtitlan in the early spring months and something feels wrong. The air carries a sound that makes your stomach clench, the wailing of children echoing from the temples and sacred caves scattered throughout the Valley of Mexico. This isn't the ordinary crying of frustrated toddlers or sleepy infants. This is sustained, heartbroken sobbing, and it's intentional. The priests of Tlaloc, the rain god, are conducting their most controversial ceremony, and those tears streaming down small faces aren't just expressions of fear. Their prayers made liquid, offerings meant to coax moisture from the sky itself. The Aztec agricultural calendar depended entirely on seasonal rains. Too little, and crops withered in the fields. Famine stalked the empire and thousands starved. Too much, and floods destroyed everything, sweeping away homes and drowning the carefully tended chinampas, those ingenious floating gardens that fed the massive population of Tenochtitlan. Tlaloc held the power of life and death in his turquoise hands, and he demanded a very specific tribute: the tears and lives of children. You watch as a procession winds through the city streets. The children selected for this honour, and yes, families genuinely considered it an honour, though that might be difficult for modern minds to grasp, are dressed in elaborate costumes of blue and green, the colours of water and growing things. Paper headdresses adorned with heron feathers crown their heads. Their faces are painted with liquid rubber to represent rain clouds. Some are carried in ornate litters decorated with quetzal feathers. Others walk, bewildered, holding the hands of priests who guide them toward their destinations. Historians still argue whether these children were primarily slaves purchased for the ceremony, offspring of nobles who volunteered their sons and daughters for the good of the empire, or a mix of both. The Spanish chronicles offer contradictory accounts, and the Aztecs themselves left no written explanations that survived the conquest's systematic destruction of their codices. What we know for certain is that the children were young, typically between the ages of 3 and 7, and that they were selected based on specific physical criteria. Those with 2 whorls in their hair, a double crown as we might call it today, were considered especially favourable to Tlaloc. The quirky detail: if a child had been born during a rainstorm, they were practically guaranteed selection, as if the rain god had already marked them as his own from birth. The processions don't head to the main temples in the city centre. Instead, they wind towards sacred locations throughout the empire: mountain tops, caves, the shores of Lake Texcoco, and springs considered holy. 7 specific sites are mentioned in the historical records, each associated with different aspects of Tlaloc's power. One location might call for rain to fill the mountain streams. Another might petition for gentle moisture to nurture seedlings. A third might ask for the late summer storms that would swell the maize ears before harvest. Now comes the part that made even hardened Spanish conquistadors, men who'd witnessed countless battlefield horrors, pause in their writings with obvious discomfort. The priest needed the children to cry, not just whimper or sniffle, but produce genuine streaming tears, because in the symbolic logic of Aztec ritual, those tears were sympathetic magic of the most literal kind. As the children's tears fell, so too would rain fall from the sky. The more they cried, the better the rains would be. A child who went to their death bravely, with dry eyes, was actually considered a bad omen. It suggested the sky itself would remain dry. So the priests employed various methods to ensure tears flowed freely. Sometimes they would pinch the children or pull their hair, minor cruelties designed to provoke crying without causing real harm. Other times they would separate children from their parents at the last moment, letting the natural grief of separation do the work. The chronicler Diego Duran reported that if a child stopped crying during the journey, the priests would become anxious and redouble their efforts to provoke tears, seeing the child's composure as a threat to the empire's agricultural survival. You follow one procession to Mount Tlaloc, the rain god's namesake mountain that towers over the eastern edge of the Valley of Mexico. The climb takes hours. The thin air at altitude makes breathing difficult. The priests chant continuously, their voices rising and falling like waves. When they reach the sacred shrine near the summit, they perform the final rituals. The children are dressed in their finest regalia one last time. Offerings of rubber, copal incense, and precious papers are burned. And then the children are sealed in caves or drowned in the sacred spring that bubbles from the mountain's heart. The logic in Aztec cosmological terms was actually quite consistent. Tlaloc resided in Tlalocan, a paradise of eternal spring located in the east. People who died by drowning, lightning strike, or certain diseases associated with water went directly to Tlalocan, bypassing the difficult 9-level journey through Mictlan, the underworld that most souls had to navigate. They spent eternity in a garden of perpetual flowers, abundance, and joy. By sending children to Tlalocan through ritual drowning, the Aztecs believed they were creating direct messengers who would plead humanity's case before Tlaloc, asking him to release the rains. The children became tiny ambassadors, forever young, forever innocent, forever whispering requests for moisture in the rain god's ear. But let's pause here for a reality check that might make you squirm. We're lying in our comfortable beds, probably in climate-controlled rooms, with grocery stores full of food mere minutes away. Our survival doesn't depend on whether it rains next week. We turn on taps and water appears. We open refrigerators and find food. The Aztecs lived in a fundamentally different reality. One bad growing season could mean watching your neighbour's children develop the swollen bellies of starvation. 2 bad seasons could collapse the social order entirely. In that context, the sacrifice of a few children to ensure the survival of hundreds of thousands starts to make a terrible, tragic sense. Not moral sense, we don't have to approve, but practical sense within their worldview. Mainstream historical fact: archaeological excavations at the Great Temple in Mexico City have uncovered the remains of 42 children buried in offerings to Tlaloc, their bones showing evidence of the ritual treatment described in Spanish chronicles. These aren't myths or propaganda, they're physical evidence of practices that genuinely occurred. The ceremonies typically occurred during the first months of the Aztec year, corresponding roughly to February through April in our calendar. This timing aligned with the critical pre-planting season, when farmers needed to know whether the rains would come. A ceremony called Atlcahualo, meaning the stopping of water, kicked off the ritual calendar. Despite the name suggesting water's absence, it actually celebrated the anticipation of the rainy season's return. Children were sacrificed at this time to jumpstart the hydrological cycle, to remind Tlaloc that his people were desperate, faithful, and willing to offer their most precious treasures, their children, for his favour. The emotional weight of these ceremonies must have been staggering. Parents who volunteered their children believed they were performing the greatest act of piety possible. The children themselves, indoctrinated from birth in the religion's teachings, might have felt a mixture of terror and pride, and the priests, carrying out these rituals year after year, must have developed some psychological mechanism to cope with the sounds of children crying themselves toward death. Or perhaps they genuinely believed so deeply that the dissonance never troubled them. Faith can insulate the mind from almost anything. One element that often gets overlooked is the complexity of Tlaloc himself. He wasn't simply a rain god in the way we might imagine, some bearded skyman opening and closing cloud faucets. Tlaloc represented all water in all its forms: rain, rivers, springs, dew, frost, hail, floods. He could be beneficent or destructive. He could nourish or drown. His paradise, Tlalocan, was described as a place of eternal abundance, but he could just as easily send devastating storms that flattened crops and destroyed homes. The children's sacrifice to him were meant to emphasize the gentle, life-giving aspects of his nature. Look, the people were saying, "We offer you innocence. We offer you tears of pure water from pure hearts. Please in return offer us the gentle rains, not the destroying floods." You're standing in the massive courtyard of the Templo Mayor, and the crowd around you is pressed so tightly that you can barely move. It's the festival of Tlacaxipewalistli, and today you'll witness something the Aztecs called a fair fight. Though, as you're about to discover, fairness has a very different definition when the gods are watching. In the centre of the plaza sits the Temalacatl, a massive circular stone about waist-high and several feet across, carved with intricate scenes of cosmic warfare. A captured warrior from a neighbouring city-state is being led toward it, and despite the honour he's about to receive, you can see the recognition in his eyes. He knows exactly what's coming. The gladiator sacrifice, or Tlahuitole as the Aztecs called it, represents one of the empire's most theatrical and brutal rituals. It's part sporting event, part religious ceremony, part public execution, and part cosmic drama. The captured warrior being brought forward has likely spent weeks or even months in captivity, fed well and treated with respect. He's not some random prisoner of war. He's been chosen specifically because of his proven prowess in battle. The Aztecs believed that sacrificing a weak or cowardly warrior was insulting to the gods. They wanted champions, heroes, men who demonstrated their worth on the battlefield. Only the best would do. The warrior is stripped to a loincloth and brought to the Temalacatl. A rope is tied around his waist and the other end is secured to a hole bored through the centre of the stone. The rope's length allows him to move around the stone's circumference but prevents him from running away. He's given weapons, but here's where the fairness becomes questionable. Instead of a proper maquahuitl, that devastating obsidian-bladed sword that could decapitate a horse with a single stroke, he receives a wooden club decorated with feathers instead of blades. Imagine going into combat with a pool noodle while your opponents carry chainsaws, and you'll get the general idea. His opponents are some of the Empire's finest warriors, Jaguar Knights and Eagle Knights, the elite military orders whose members had proven themselves by capturing at least 4 enemies in battle. These men wear elaborate costumes representing their orders, jaguar pelts draped over their shoulders, eagle helmets with beaks that jut forward menacingly. They carry real weapons with real obsidian blades that can cut through flesh and bone with terrifying efficiency. The fair fight is about to begin. A priest raises his hand, then drops it. The combat erupts. The tethered warrior swings his feathered club desperately, trying to create space between himself and his attackers. The crowd roars, drums thunder, shell trumpets blast. The Jaguar Knight lunges first, his maquahuitl whistling through the air. The prisoner parries, barely, and attempts a counter-strike that bounces harmlessly off his opponent's padded cotton armour. An Eagle Knight circles behind, looking for an opening. Historians still argue whether any captive ever actually won these contests. Some chronicles suggest that exceptionally skilled warriors could fight off their attackers long enough to earn immediate death by sacrifice, rather than the prolonged version, which we'll discuss in the next section. Other accounts claim the entire spectacle was rigged from the start, pure theatre with a predetermined outcome. But evidence suggests that occasionally, very occasionally, a warrior's performance was so impressive that he might be granted his life and adopted into Aztec society, though this was extraordinarily rare. The tethered warrior manages to land a solid blow with his feathered club against an Eagle Knight's shoulder. The crowd gasps. For just a moment he's winning, his training and desperation combining into something almost transcendent. But then a jaguar knight's blade finds his thigh, opening a deep gash. Blood sprays across the stone platform. The warrior stumbles but doesn't fall. He's been trained since childhood to ignore pain, to fight until his body literally cannot continue. He swings again, catches another attacker across the forearm, a glancing blow, barely enough to bruise, but it's something. The combat continues for what feels like hours but is probably only 15 or 20 minutes. Gradually, inevitably, the accumulated wounds take their toll. The prisoner's movements slow. His breathing becomes ragged. Blood pools around his feet, making the stone slippery. Finally, a Makwahuitl blade catches him across the ribs, and he collapses to his knees. The Eagle Knights and Jaguar Knights step back. The combat portion is complete. Now comes the sacrifice. But here's the quirky detail that often surprises people. Before the actual heart extraction, priests would sometimes revive the warrior if he'd passed out from blood loss. They'd splash water on his face, give him pulque, a fermented agave drink to fortify him, even bandage some of the wounds. Why? Because the sacrifice needed to happen at the top of the pyramid, and they needed the victim conscious and aware for the ritual to carry its full spiritual weight. A corpse or an unconscious body wouldn't suffice. The gods wanted to receive a life force that was aware it was being given. It's almost darkly considerate in a twisted way, like saying, "Here, have a drink before we kill you," might somehow make the whole thing more civilized. The warrior is carried or dragged up the pyramid steps, leaving a trail of blood that priests will later scrub clean with sacred water. At the summit, 4 priests grab his limbs and bend him backward over the sacrificial stone, the Tenochtitlan. His chest arches upward, ribs spreading, heart hammering beneath skin and muscle. The high priest approaches with the obsidian knife and, well, we'll get into the technical specifics of heart extraction later. For now, just know that the warrior's journey ends here, at the highest point in the city, his blood flowing down the pyramid steps in channels carved specifically for that purpose. Mainstream historical fact. Archaeological evidence from the Templo Mayor excavations includes worn circular stones matching the descriptions of Tenochtitlan platforms, with rope grooves carved into their centres exactly as the chronicles describe. Spanish conquistador Bernal Diaz del Castillo witnessed these gladiator sacrifices personally and recorded them in his memoirs with the kind of vivid detail that suggests genuine trauma. The symbolism layered into this ritual runs deep. The Tenochtitlan represented the cosmic battlefield where order and chaos eternally combat each other. The tethered warrior symbolized humanity itself, tied to fate, struggling against overwhelming odds, ultimately unable to escape the divine plan. His feathered weapon represented the 4 previous ages of the world, each of which had ended in catastrophe. The Jaguar and Eagle Knights represented the sun and the earth, the 2 fundamental forces that needed constant nourishment through sacrifice. Every element meant something, connected to something, represented something larger than the immediate violence. And from the warrior's perspective, if he'd been raised in Aztec culture or a similar Mesoamerican society, he understood the cosmic stakes. Yes, he was going to die. Yes, the fight was impossibly weighted against him. But his death would feed Huitzilopochtli, the sun god, giving strength for the sun's nightly battle against darkness. His blood would ensure that tomorrow's dawn would come, that the world would persist for another day. In a very real sense, his death was more meaningful than his entire life had been. He was becoming part of the cosmic machinery that kept reality functioning. There's something almost sports-like about the whole affair that makes it even more unsettling. The crowd doesn't just watch solemnly, they cheer, gasp, shout encouragement. Betting probably occurred, though the chronicles don't explicitly mention it. Vendors would have sold food and drinks. Children would have sat on their parents' shoulders for a better view. It was entertainment intertwined with religion, intertwined with politics, intertwined with cosmic necessity. Modern people tend to separate these categories. We have sports stadiums, churches, and government buildings as distinct spaces. The Aztecs collapsed all of it into single events that served multiple functions simultaneously. One account describes a Tlaxcalan warrior who fought so magnificently during his gladiator sacrifice that the Aztec Emperor Ahuitzotl reportedly stood up and applauded, then offered to spare the man's life and make him a military commander. The warrior refused. He had already accepted his death, made peace with it, prepared his soul for the journey to the sun. To survive now would be shameful, a betrayal of his people and his gods. So he requested that the sacrifice proceed, and it did. That story might be apocryphal. Legends tend to grow around dramatic moments, but it captures something true about the mindset. Death in the gladiator sacrifice wasn't seen as tragedy. It was seen as the culmination of a warrior's life, the moment when everything he'd trained for finally mattered on a cosmic scale. You're walking through Tenochtitlan during the festival of Tlacaxipehualistli, the flaying of men, and something immediately strikes you as profoundly wrong. The priests moving through the crowds aren't wearing their usual cotton robes or jaguar pelts or elaborate feather headdresses. They're wearing human skin, complete human skin. Faces drooping like masks, hands dangling like gloves, entire bodysuits of flesh that have been carefully removed from sacrificial victims and now adorn the living like the world's most disturbing costumes. Welcome to the most viscerally unsettling ritual in the Aztec religious calendar, the 20-day festival honouring Tziptotec, the flayed lord, god of agricultural renewal, springtime, and, appropriately enough, goldsmiths. The symbolism, once you understand it, makes a certain agricultural logic. Spring is when the earth sheds its dead, dry winter skin and reveals the green growth beneath. Seeds burst through their husks, snakes shed their old scales. The world transforms itself through a process of death and rebirth. Tziptotec personified this transformation, and his priests demonstrated the concept in the most literal way possible. By wearing the shed skins of the dead, they embodied the principle that new life emerges from death's discarded shell. The festival begins with the gladiator sacrifices you just witnessed on the Tenochtitlan. But those warriors who died fighting aren't simply carried away for disposal. No, their bodies serve a secondary sacred purpose. Teams of priests trained specifically in the art of flaying descend on the corpses with obsidian knives sharper than modern surgical scalpels. What follows is a process that's part butchery, part surgery, part performance art. The flaying priests make careful incisions. They start at the back, slicing from the neck downward, then working around the sides. The goal is to remove the entire skin in one piece, like peeling off a full-body wetsuit. This requires exceptional skill. Cut too deep and you damage the skin, rendering it useless for wearing. Cut too shallow, and the skin won't separate from the muscle and fascia beneath. The priests who could perform this operation quickly and cleanly were highly respected specialists, their expertise passed down through generations of religious families. Historians still argue whether the skins were treated with any preservatives, or if they were worn fresh and allowed to decay over the 20-day period. Some Spanish chronicles mention a horrible stench surrounding the skin-wearing priests, suggesting the latter. Other accounts describe the skins becoming stiff and leathery as they dried, which implies they might have been treated with salt or lime. What's certain is that wearing decomposing human flesh for nearly 3 weeks was considered an honour, a profound act of devotion that brought the wearer closer to Totec himself. Once removed, the skins were carefully prepared. Facial skins were treated as masks, with eye holes cut to allow the wearer to see. Hand skins dangled from the wrists like grotesque gloves. The full body skins were donned like clothing, complete with the previous occupant's genitals still attached. Sources make specific mention of this detail, noting that the dangling appendages would swing as the priests walked. The priests wearing these skins were called zipim, and for the duration of the festival, they were considered to be Totec himself made manifest on earth. The Zipimi spent the 20 days wandering through the city, visiting homes and businesses. Householders were expected to give them food, drink, and small gifts. To turn away a skin-wearing priest was to invite Totec's displeasure, which could manifest as boils, scabs, skin diseases, or crop failures. So people welcomed these walking corpse suits into their homes, fed them, honoured them, and tried very hard not to vomit from the smell. Imagine opening your door to find a priest wearing someone else's face, the skin sagging and yellowing and beginning to rot, and having to invite him in for dinner. That's commitment to your religious obligations. Here's the quirky detail that often gets overlooked. Goldsmiths held a special connection to Totec and played a central role in his festival. Why goldsmiths? Because metalworking involves transformation through fire and violence. You take raw ore, heat it until it melts, pound it into new shapes, and create something beautiful from something crude. The process mirrors exactly what Totec represented: violent transformation that results in renewal. During the festival, goldsmiths would sponsor some of the sacrifices, dress slaves or captives in elaborate gold jewellery, then sacrifice them and wear their skins. The gold and the flesh, wealth and death, beauty and horror, all twisted together into a single ritual statement about the nature of creation. But the flaying ritual extended beyond just the priests. Commoners participated too, in a somewhat less intensive version. Young men would take strips of flayed skin, usually from arms or legs, and wear them tied around their own limbs or foreheads. They'd go through the city challenging people to mock battles, playful wrestling matches, or even just requesting tribute. Anyone who refused might have the rotting skin rubbed in their face, which apparently counted as both hilarious comedy and sacred terror. Nothing says spring festival quite like having decomposing human flesh shoved at you by laughing teenagers, right? The theological underpinning is actually quite sophisticated once you dig past the initial revulsion. Totec was particularly associated with curing skin diseases, eye afflictions, and agricultural blights. People suffering from rashes, infections, or blindness would petition him for healing. The act of wearing the skin represented the god taking on human suffering, literally wrapping himself in humanity's pain and death, and then transcending it as the skin decayed and fell away. The priest emerging from the rotting skin at the festival's end symbolized renewal, healing, and the triumph of life over death. The person who'd been sacrificed wasn't seen as a victim, but as a transformative agent whose death enabled life for others. Mainstream historical fact: the Florentine Codex, compiled by Bernardino de Sahagún with input from Aztec informants, contains detailed illustrations of the skin-wearing ritual, showing priests with clearly visible human faces worn as masks and dangling hand skins. Archaeological evidence from the Templo Mayor includes flaying knives and remains showing marks consistent with systematic skin removal. At the festival's conclusion, after 20 days of wearing gradually putrefying human flesh, the priests would finally remove the skins. This was itself a ritual event. The skins were taken to special caves or buried in specific locations within the temple complex. The priests underwent extensive purification rituals, ritual bathing, fasting, bloodletting, to separate themselves from the god they'd been embodying. They'd spent nearly 3 weeks as Zyp-Totec, and now they had to become human again. The psychological transition must have been intense. Spanish conquistadors and friars who witnessed or heard detailed accounts of this festival were uniformly horrified. Bernal Diaz del Castillo described it as the most terrible thing I have ever seen. Diego Duran called it a spectacle of supreme horror. Yet even these disgusted observers couldn't help but note the Aztecs' apparent reverence during the ceremonies. These weren't savages gleefully mutilating corpses. They were devout people enacting what they believed to be a necessary cosmic ritual, as serious and sacred as any Christian mass or Jewish temple service. There's an uncomfortable question we have to sit with. Why does wearing skin disturb us so much more than, say, heart extraction? Both involve dead bodies. Both involve violence and desecration from our modern perspective. But something about the skin wearing feels especially transgressive, especially wrong. Maybe it's because wearing someone's face is such an intimate violation of identity. Or maybe it's because the skin wearers were alive, walking around, interacting with people. The dead weren't safely contained on an altar or buried in the ground. They were mobile, active, present in a way that challenges our fundamental categories of living and dead. The festival also served important social functions beyond the religious symbolism. It reinforced the Aztec military ideology by honoring warriors captured in battle. Even in death, they served the empire. It created opportunities for social mobility, as skilled flayers and dedicated zipimi could gain prestige. It allowed goldsmiths to display their wealth and piety simultaneously. It gave commoners a chance to participate in sacred activities usually reserved for elites. And it reminded everyone, viscerally and unavoidably, that death and life exist in a constant relationship, that one feeds the other, that transformation requires sacrifice. Do you remember standing in the darkness during the new fire ceremony, waiting to see if the universe would continue? That festival was about cosmic anxiety, the fear that everything might end. This festival of Zyp-Totec represents something different. Cosmic confidence. The world will renew itself. Spring will come. The earth will shed its dead skin and produce abundance again. Death is not an ending but a transformation. And if you have to wear rotting human flesh for 20 days to prove that point, well, that's just the price of devotion. You're standing in a crowded plaza in Tenochtitlan, and a young man walks past you who makes everyone stop and stare. He's breathtakingly beautiful. The Aztecs selected him specifically for his physical perfection. He wears a cloak woven from the finest cotton, dyed in rich colours that would bankrupt an ordinary family. Jade beads hang around his neck. Gold bracelets gleam on his wrists. Flowers are woven into his hair, which has been carefully styled and perfumed. He plays a clay flute as he walks, and the melody drifts over the crowd like incense smoke. People bow as he passes. Priests step aside. Even nobles lower their eyes respectfully. This young man is the Exiptla, the living image of the god Tezcatlipoca, lord of the smoking mirror, deity of night, sorcery, and destiny. And in exactly 1 year from today, he will climb the steps of the temple and willingly offer his own heart to the gods. The selection process for this role was extraordinarily rigorous. The priests would search throughout the empire for a young man, typically around 20 years old, who embodied physical perfection according to Aztec aesthetics. No scars, no blemishes, no deformities, symmetrical features, graceful movements, a voice capable of carrying a tune, intelligence enough to learn the elaborate rituals he'd need to perform, and crucially the right temperament, composed, dignified, capable of accepting his fate without visible fear or reluctance. Finding someone who met all these criteria could take months or even years. Once selected, the young man's life transformed utterly. He was brought to the temple complex and given quarters more luxurious than most nobles enjoyed. Servants attended his every need. Cooks prepared elaborate meals. He wore clothing that would have made emperors jealous. He learned to play musical instruments, particularly the clay flute, which became his signature. He was taught poetry, rhetoric, theology, and the intricate details of ritual protocol. For the next year, his education rivaled that of any prince in the empire. He was being groomed not just to represent a god, but to become one in the eyes of the people. His daily routine involved wandering through the city playing his flute, a sound that announced Tezcatlipoca's presence among mortals. People would emerge from their homes to see him pass, to catch a glimpse of the god walking in human form. Children would run alongside him, giggling with delight. Vendors would offer him gifts of fruit, flowers, or delicacies. Young women would swoon, literally swoon, according to some accounts, overcome by his beauty and sacred status. He was untouchable, unreachable, a living divine presence that made the gods feel closer, more real, more invested in human affairs. Historians still argue about the psychological state of these Exiptla. Did they genuinely embrace their role, or were they prisoners hiding terror behind a religious mask? The chronicles suggest that most accepted their fate with apparent serenity, possibly because they'd been indoctrinated to believe they were fulfilling the highest possible destiny. To become a god, even temporarily, to experience a year of unimaginable luxury and worship, and then to join the gods permanently in the celestial realm. For someone raised in Aztec theology, this might genuinely seem preferable to a long life of ordinary hardship. 20 days before the festival of Tenochtitlan, the ceremony that would culminate in his sacrifice, the Exiptla's life shifted again. He was given 4 young women as wives, themselves chosen for beauty, and selected to represent 4 different goddesses: Xochiquetzal, flowers and love; Xilonin, young maize; Atlatonin, lepers and disease; and Huixtoquihuatl, salt. These weren't marriages in the permanent sense. They were temporary sacred unions that lasted only 20 days. But during that time, the Exiptla and his 4 goddess wives lived as divine royalty, hosting banquets, attending ceremonies, and embodying the complex relationships between different divine forces. Here's the quirky detail that shows how thoroughly the Aztecs thought through their symbolism. The 4 wives represented the 4 previous cosmic ages that had already been destroyed. The Exiptla's union with them represented Tezcatlipoca gathering all previous cycles of existence into himself, before the sacrifice that would renew the current age. Every element was layered with meaning, nothing was random or merely decorative. As Tenochtitlan approached, the tone shifted. The festivities became more intense, almost frantic. Banquets grew more elaborate. Music played constantly. The Exiptla and his wives were escorted to different temples throughout the city, performing rituals at each one. It was as if the empire was trying to pack as much life, celebration, and divine presence as possible into the remaining days. The young man must have felt time compressing, each sunset bringing him closer to the pyramid's summit and the obsidian knife waiting there. On the day of Tenochtitlan, the Exiptla was dressed in the most elaborate costume yet. His body was painted black with white stripes, mimicking Tezcatlipoca's traditional appearance. The finest feathered headdress was placed on his head. He was given Tezcatlipoca's signature smoking mirror, made of polished obsidian, to carry. His 4 wives accompanied him in a grand procession through Tenochtitlan, moving toward the small temple that would be his final destination. The temple wasn't Templo Maya, the great pyramid at the city's heart. Instead, the Exiptla climbed a smaller temple called Tlacochcalco, located outside the main urban area. The separation was intentional. This sacrifice was more intimate, less public spectacle, and more private communion between God and cosmos. His 4 wives remained at the base. The servants who'd attended him for a year stayed behind. He ascended alone, playing his flute with each step, the melody carrying across the city one last time. As he climbed, he broke the clay flutes he'd carried during his year as God made flesh. 1 flute on the first step, another on the 5th, another on the 10th. The breaking of the instruments symbolized the breaking of his earthly existence, the shattering of the illusion that had sustained him for 12 months. Each crack of clay was a small death, preparing him for the final ultimate transformation. At the summit, the priests waited. 4 of them seized him, bent him backward over the sacrificial stone, and the high priest performed the heart extraction. Unlike some sacrifices where the victim might struggle or cry out, the chronicles emphasize that the Exiptla of Tezcatlipoca typically went to his death with composed dignity, maintaining the divine bearing he'd cultivated for the entire year. To show fear or resistance at this point would negate everything the ritual represented. He had to embody the god until the very last heartbeat. Mainstream historical fact. The Florentine Codex describes the Exiptla ritual in extensive detail across multiple chapters, including illustrations showing the young man playing his flute and his ascent up the temple stairs. Spanish Friar Diego Duran provides a parallel account that corroborates most details, suggesting this wasn't propaganda, but an actual religious practice witnessed by multiple chroniclers. The moment the Exiptla's heart stopped beating, another young man was immediately selected and began his year-long journey toward the same fate. The cycle never broke. There was always a living Tezcatlipoca walking the streets of Tenochtitlan, always a beautiful young man whose life would end on a pyramid summit in exactly 12 months. The continuity was essential. The god couldn't be absent even for a single day. From a modern psychological perspective, the entire institution seems almost unbearably cruel. Take a young person in the prime of life, give them everything they could possibly want, make them the center of attention and worship, and then kill them just as they've reached the peak of their existence. It's like grooming someone for the world's most prestigious position and then revealing that the job ends with execution. And yet, the Aztec worldview didn't see it as cruel. It was sacred duty, divine honor, cosmic necessity. The Exiptla wasn't losing his life. He was completing it, fulfilling a destiny that elevated him above all ordinary mortals. There's something almost tragic about imagining that young man's psychology during his final days. Did he wake up each morning counting how many sunrises remained? Did he look at his reflection and wonder which face was real, his own or the god's he'd been embodying? When he lay with his 4 goddess wives, did he think of them as divine beings, or simply as young women caught in the same inexorable ritual machinery? Did the luxury comfort him or mock him? All those beautiful things he'd possess only briefly before possessing nothing at all. The Spanish who documented this ritual couldn't decide whether to see the Exiptler as an honoured participant or a doomed victim. Some chroniclers wrote admiringly of his composure and dignity. Others expressed horror at the manipulation and inevitable death. Both perspectives might be true simultaneously. He was honoured and doomed, willing and trapped, divine and utterly human. The ritual existed in the space where all these contradictions met and merged into something that made sense within Aztec cosmology, even as it horrifies modern sensibilities. Do you remember the warrior tied to the gladiator stone fighting impossible odds with a feathered club? That was about courage in the face of certain death. The Exiptler ritual is about something different, about living with certain death, about carrying the knowledge of your exact expiration date and still choosing to play your flute, to smile, to embody divinity, to walk toward the pyramid with measured steps and quiet grace. It's about a year-long sacrifice where every luxurious moment is simultaneously gift and countdown, where godhood and doom are identical. You're watching 5 men climb an impossibly tall pole planted in the centre of Tenochtitlan's main plaza. The pole stretches 30 metres into the sky, about 10 stories high in modern terms, and at the top sits a small wooden platform barely large enough for the 5 men to stand together. 4 of them wear elaborate costumes representing the 4 cardinal directions and the 4 elements. The 5th, dressed as a bird deity, carries a drum and flute. There are no safety harnesses, no nets below, no modern precautions whatsoever. In a few moments these men will throw themselves from that platform and fly in descending circles around the pole, suspended only by ropes wrapped around their waists, spinning 13 times each to complete the sacred mathematics. Welcome to the Danza de los Voladores, the Dance of the Flyers, one of Mesoamerica's most breathtaking and dangerous rituals. The ceremony you're witnessing predates the Aztec Empire by centuries. It originated among the Huastec or Totonac peoples of the Gulf Coast region, then spread throughout Mesoamerica as a crucial agricultural and astronomical ritual. The Aztecs adopted it enthusiastically, recognizing its power to honor Xipe Totec and the sun god, while demonstrating human courage and devotion in the most literal, death-defying way possible. The mathematical precision built into the ceremony reveals just how sophisticated Mesoamerican astronomical knowledge was. 4 flyers, each circling 13 times, produces 52 total revolutions, matching the length of the Aztec calendar round, that same 52-year cycle you witnessed during the new fire ceremony. Nothing in these rituals happened by accident. The preparation for this ceremony began weeks earlier in a sacred forest. Priests and the volunteer flyers would search for the perfect tree, usually a tall, straight pine that reached at least 30 meters in height and was thick enough to be stable when planted in the ground. Finding such a tree required both botanical knowledge and spiritual guidance. The tree had to be unblemished, without disease or major branches that would create imbalance. Once selected, offerings were made to the tree spirit, asking permission to take its life for sacred purposes. Think of it as the Aztec equivalent of, "Excuse me, tree, but we need to turn you into a divine apparatus." The prayers and rituals could last for days. When the tree was finally felled, the entire process was treated as a sacrifice in itself. The tree wasn't merely lumber, it was a living being giving its life for the gods, not unlike the human sacrifices happening elsewhere in the city. The trunk was carefully stripped of bark and branches, carved with sacred symbols, then transported to the city centre with enormous effort. Historians still argue about exactly how teams managed to move these massive poles without wheeled vehicles or draft animals, but rope systems, rollers made from smaller logs, and hundreds of workers pulling in coordination got the job done. Erecting the pole required its own ceremony. A deep hole was dug in the plaza, about 3 meters deep, and offerings were placed at the bottom. Food, incense, sometimes blood from the workers' self-sacrificial bloodletting. The pole was walked upright, dozens of men steadying it with ropes as it tilted skyward, then dropped into the hole with a ground-shaking thud that you could feel through your feet. Earth was packed around the base, and the pole was tested for stability. Any wobble or lean could mean death for the flyers, so the installation had to be perfect. At the top of the pole, a wooden square frame called a quadro was attached, and from its 4 corners hung the ropes that would hold the flyers. The 5th performer, the caporal or captain, would stand or sit on a tiny platform at the very peak, exposed to the wind and sky with nothing but balance and faith keeping him aloft. Even getting up there the first time required remarkable climbing ability and absolute courage. One slip, one moment of dizziness, and you'd plummet to certain death on the stone plaza below. Here's the quirky detail that demonstrates both the Aztecs' engineering ingenuity and their dark sense of irony. The ropes attached to the flyers weren't just tied around their waists. They were wound around the pole itself many times, and as the flyers threw themselves backward off the platform, the ropes would slowly unwind, allowing controlled descent in widening circles. The physics had to be calculated precisely. Rope length, weight of the flyers, wind conditions, even the moisture content of the rope, which could affect its stretch and strength. Get any of these factors wrong and the flyers might crash into the pole, tangle together, or simply fall. This was advanced engineering dressed up as religious ritual, or perhaps advanced religious ritual that required engineering expertise. The categories merged seamlessly. The ceremony itself begins with the caporal climbing to the summit while playing a drum and flute simultaneously, because apparently climbing a 30-meter pole isn't challenging enough without adding musical performance. Once at the top, he performs a ritual dance on that tiny platform, turning to face each of the 4 cardinal directions, invoking the gods associated with each quarter of the cosmos. The crowd below watches in breathless silence. One wrong step, and he's dead. The dance is both prayer and demonstration, asking the gods for protection, while proving human courage worthy of divine attention. Then the 4 flyers climb up, taking positions at the corners of the quadro. They attach their ropes around their waists, make final adjustments to their costumes, and prepare for the moment that will earn this ritual its name. The caporal sounds a signal on his flute. The 4 flyers simultaneously lean backward and launch themselves into space, arms spread like wings, and begin their slow, spinning descent around the pole. As they circle downward, the flyers don't just hang limply. They perform aerial acrobatics, spreading their arms and legs to look like birds in flight, sometimes spinning their bodies independent of the rope's rotation, occasionally even playing small flutes or rattles as they descend. Remember, these men are spiraling through the air on a rope with no backup safety equipment whatsoever, and they're worried about maintaining proper form and hitting their musical cues. The combination of grace, danger, and ritual precision is genuinely breathtaking. Mainstream historical fact: Spanish chronicler Diego Muñoz Camargo documented the volador ceremony in detail in the 1580s, including diagrams showing the pole, the flyers, and the rope mechanics. The ritual was so widespread and impressive that multiple conquistadors mentioned it in their accounts, and it survived the conquest in modified forms that continue to this day in parts of Mexico and Central America. The symbolism woven through every element is characteristically complex. The 4 flyers represent the 4 cardinal directions, the 4 previous cosmic ages, the 4 elements, and the 4 primary gods who hold up the sky at its corners. Their 13 rotations each create the sacred number 52 when multiplied by 4, that calendar round again, that fundamental unit of cosmic time. The caporal at the summit represents the axis mundi, the cosmic axis that connects earth and sky, underworld and heavens. The pole itself is a world tree, a living connection between different realms of existence, and the flying descent represents the sun's daily journey across the sky, or alternatively, the descent of gods from the celestial realm to bless the earth with their presence. But beyond all the symbolism, there's just the raw spectacle of it. Imagine watching 4 men throw themselves backward off a platform 10 stories up. See them plummet for a heart-stopping instant before the rope catches and they begin their graceful spiralling descent. The crowd would gasp, then cheer, then fall silent again as they watched the aerial ballet. Children would point and shriek with delight. Visitors from other cities would stand with mouths open, hardly believing what they were witnessing. It was entertainment and devotion and mathematical demonstration and proof of human courage all bound together in 4.5 minutes of controlled falling. Of course, things sometimes went wrong. Ropes broke. Wind gusts slammed flyers into the pole. Knots came untied. The chronicles don't dwell on these failures, but they must have happened. When they did, the result was immediate and catastrophic. A flyer hitting the stone plaza from 30 meters up wouldn't survive. His death would be considered sacrificial, unintended perhaps, but still an offering to the gods. The ceremony would be completed with the remaining flyers if possible, or begun again with replacements if necessary. The ritual's continuation mattered more than individual survival. There's something almost modern about the Volador ceremony, something that speaks to a universal human impulse that transcends cultural boundaries. People today pay money to bungee jump, skydive, or ride roller coasters, to experience controlled danger, to flirt with death while trusting that engineering and physics will save them. The Aztec flyers were doing essentially the same thing 500 years earlier, except their controlled danger served religious rather than recreational purposes. Or maybe those categories aren't as separate as we think. Maybe the thrill seeker and the devotee are responding to the same fundamental human need to transcend ordinary existence, to touch something larger than themselves, even if only for the few minutes they're falling through the air. Do you remember the Exiptler playing his flute as he climbed the pyramid, breaking clay instruments with each step toward his death? The Volador ceremony offers an inverted image, musicians climbing toward the sky, rather than ascending towards sacrifice. Performers who, usually, descend safely rather than dying at the summit. Both rituals use height and music to bridge the gap between human and divine. But one ends in death while the other, if the gods are merciful and the ropes hold true, ends in survival and celebration. The contrast tells us something important about Aztec spirituality. It wasn't uniformly obsessed with death and blood, despite what the most famous rituals suggest. Sometimes the offering was courage rather than life, performance rather than sacrifice, the willingness to risk death rather than death itself. You're walking toward the Templo Mayor, and long before you reach the pyramid itself, you encounter something that makes your steps falter. Rising from the plaza like a grotesque garden is the Tzompantli, the skull rack, a massive wooden scaffold stretching hundreds of feet in length, and every horizontal beam is pierced through with human skulls. thousands upon thousands of them, arranged in precise geometric rows, their empty eye sockets staring in all directions. Some skulls are bleached white by sun and rain, obviously ancient. Others are relatively fresh, still bearing traces of flesh or hair. The sheer scale of this monument to death is overwhelming. You're not looking at evidence of violence. You're looking at violence transformed into architecture, death made into a public statement that can be read from across the city. The Spanish conquistadors who first witnessed the skull racks of Tenochtitlan couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. Andres de Tapia, one of Cortes's officers, attempted to count the skulls on the main Tzompantli and estimated around 136,000 skulls. Bernal Diaz del Castillo put the number even higher. Modern scholars debate these figures intensely. Were the Spanish exaggerating for propaganda purposes, trying to justify their conquest by painting the Aztecs as bloodthirsty monsters? Or were the numbers genuinely that astronomical? Recent archaeological discoveries suggest the truth lies somewhere uncomfortable. The skull racks were real, massive, and held far more human remains than our comfortable modern minds want to accept. The construction of a Tzompantli required both engineering skill and a steady supply of skulls. The wooden framework had to be sturdy enough to support the weight of thousands of skulls while remaining stable during earthquakes and storms. Horizontal beams called xochotl were spaced precisely to allow skulls to be threaded through holes drilled in their temples. The drilling itself was delicate work. Too much force and the skull would shatter. Too little and the hole wouldn't penetrate cleanly. Specialized workers, perhaps the same priests who performed the sacrifices or different craftsmen entirely, would prepare each skull by cleaning away the flesh, drilling the holes, then sliding them onto the beams like macabre beads on an abacus. But the skull racks weren't just practical storage for bones. They served multiple sophisticated purposes that reveal the complexity of Aztec thought. First, they were visual propaganda, a warning to visiting dignitaries from other city-states about what happened to enemies of the empire. Walk into Tenochtitlan, and one of the first things you'd see was evidence that the Aztecs had killed more people than you could easily count, and those were just the ones they bothered to display. The message was clear. Alliance with the Aztec Empire is wise. Opposition is fatal. Second, the Tzompantli functioned as a kind of sacred census, a physical record of sacrifices performed and debts paid to the gods. Each skull represented a life given to sustain the universe, a cosmic transaction completed. In this sense, the skull rack was like a spiritual ledger made of bone, proof that the Aztecs were fulfilling their obligations to keep the sun rising and the crops growing. The gods could look down and see, in tangible form, the devotion of their people. Third, and perhaps most surprisingly to modern minds, the skull racks honoured the dead. Being placed on the Tzompantli wasn't considered disrespectful. It was commemorative. Your skull on public display meant your sacrifice had been important enough to acknowledge permanently. You weren't forgotten or discarded. You were literally part of the city's sacred architecture, integrated into the religious landscape in a way that would preserve some aspect of your existence for decades or even centuries. From the Aztec perspective, having your skull on the Tzompantli was roughly equivalent to having your name inscribed on a war memorial or monument, except far more visceral and permanent. Historians still argue about the demographic composition of the skulls. Were they primarily captured warriors from foreign city-states? Criminals executed for offences against the empire? Slaves purchased specifically for sacrifice? Or did the racks include skulls from all these categories, plus others we haven't considered? The archaeological evidence is only beginning to provide answers. In 2015, archaeologists excavating near the Templo Mayor site discovered a previously unknown skull tower, a cylindrical structure made almost entirely of human skulls cemented together with lime and sand. Analysis of those skulls revealed they came from all over Mesoamerica, men and women, warriors and civilians, locals and foreigners. The Tzompantli, it turns out, was equal opportunity in its displays of death. Here's the quirky detail that shows how normalized this was in Aztec culture. Children apparently played near the skull racks without particular fear or trauma. Spanish observers noted with some bewilderment that Aztec children would run past the Tzompantli during games, use it as a landmark when giving directions, or sit in its shadow to eat lunch. What seems to us like the stuff of nightmares was to them just part of the urban landscape, unusual in scale perhaps, but not in kind. Every temple had at least a small skull rack. Many noble homes had their own miniature versions. Skulls as decoration was as common in Tenochtitlan as lawn gnomes in suburban America, which tells us something about the plasticity of human psychology. We can become accustomed to almost anything if surrounded by it from birth. The maintenance of the Tzompantli was itself a ritual activity. Priests would regularly inspect the racks, replacing wooden beams that had rotted, repositioning skulls that had shifted, adding new specimens from recent sacrifices. During certain festivals, the skull racks would be decorated with flowers, painted with bright colours, or draped with paper streamers. The juxtaposition of death and celebration, bone and beauty, was quintessentially Aztec. They didn't segregate these categories the way we do. Death wasn't the opposite of life. It was life's necessary partner, its complement, its shadow self that deserved acknowledgement and even ornamentation. Mainstream historical fact. In 2017, archaeologists uncovered a massive Tzompantli near Mexico City's Metropolitan Cathedral, containing over 650 skulls and thousands of bone fragments. Chemical analysis and dating confirmed these remains dated to the Aztec period, corroborating Spanish eyewitness accounts that had been dismissed by some scholars as exaggeration. The skull rack measured approximately 34 meters long, and evidence suggested it originally stood much taller before Spanish demolition. The Spanish response to the skull racks was complicated. On one hand, they seized on them as evidence of Aztec barbarity, using them to justify the conquest and forced conversion. Look at these pagans, they argued, displaying death like trophies, turning bones into buildings. They needed Christianity to save them from themselves. But on the other hand, some Spanish observers couldn't help but be impressed by the scale and organization of the displays. The engineering was sophisticated. The arrangement showed planning and attention to aesthetics. These weren't random piles of bones. They were curated collections, deliberately composed and maintained. The conquistadors found themselves simultaneously repulsed and grudgingly admiring, which only confused their moral certainty about the righteousness of their invasion. After the conquest, the Spanish systematically destroyed the skull racks, tearing them down and scattering the bones. They couldn't tolerate such visible reminders of the religion they were trying to erase. But the destruction was never quite complete. Skulls kept turning up in construction projects, buried in foundations, used as fill material when the Spanish rebuilt Tenochtitlan as Mexico City. The dead that had been so carefully displayed were now hidden, scattered, repurposed, no longer honoured as cosmic necessities, but treated as embarrassing refuse from a superseded worldview. There's something deeply telling about our discomfort with the Tzompantli. We're fine with war memorials that list thousands of names, We're fine with military cemeteries containing thousands of graves. We're even fine with museums displaying Egyptian mummies or medieval ossuaries where bones are arranged in decorative patterns. But the Aztec skull racks disturb us in ways those other death displays don't. Maybe it's because they're too recent, only 500 years ago rather than thousands. Maybe it's because they make the connection between religious devotion and death too explicit. Or maybe it's because they force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Given the right cultural framework, humans can normalize absolutely anything, even, especially, mass death in the name of the sacred. Do you remember the priests wearing human skin for 20 days, walking through the city as flesh-draped representatives of Zype Totec? The skull racks offered a different kind of embodied theology. Not temporary costumes, but permanent installations. Not individual priests, but collective monuments. Not decay over time, but preservation through display. Both took death and made it visible, public, impossible to ignore. The Aztecs didn't hide their dead or sanitize their mortality. They put it on display, built structures around it, integrated it into daily life. The Zompantli announced to everyone who could see it, "This is what we believe, this is what we do, this is the price of keeping the universe running. Look upon our skulls, visitor, and understand the depth of our devotion." You're standing on a hillside overlooking a broad valley between Tenochtitlan and the neighbouring city-state of Tlaxcala. Two armies face each other across the field, banners streaming, war drums pounding rhythms that make your chest vibrate. Warriors in jaguar pelts and eagle costumes raise their obsidian-bladed weapons and scream challenges at their opponents. This looks like total war, like two civilizations about to tear each other apart in a frenzy of violence. But something feels off. The armies aren't quite positioned for maximum military advantage. They're not attempting flanking maneuvers or trying to claim strategic high ground. And when they finally clash with earth-shaking roars and the clatter of wooden shields, you notice something extraordinary. They're trying to capture, not kill. Welcome to the Flower Wars. Xochiaoyotl in Nahuatl arranged battles that existed not to conquer territory or settle political disputes, but purely to harvest prisoners for sacrifice. The concept feels paradoxical to modern military thinking. Wars exist to accomplish objectives, seize land, control resources, eliminate threats, impose political will. But the Flower Wars had none of these conventional goals. They were ceremonial combat, sacred sport, theological warfare where the point wasn't victory in any strategic sense, but rather the acquisition of captives whose hearts would eventually feed the gods. It's as if two nations agreed to have a war purely for religious purposes, like scheduling a battle the way you might schedule a church service or a sporting event. The origins of the Flower Wars are debated among historians, but most accounts trace them to the mid-1450s during a period of catastrophic drought and famine in the Valley of Mexico. The traditional story goes that the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma I and rulers of nearby city-states, particularly the Tlaxcalans, who remained independent despite Aztec expansion, faced a theological crisis. The drought suggested the gods were displeased. Sacrifices needed to increase to restore cosmic balance. But the Aztecs had already conquered most of their immediate neighbours, and there were no active wars producing the steady stream of captives required for the sacrifice schedules. The solution? Create artificial wars specifically designed to generate prisoners while maintaining formal peace treaties and trade relationships. The arrangement worked brilliantly in its own twisted way. Tlaxcala and other independent city-states agreed to regular scheduled battles with Aztec forces. The combats would occur at predetermined times and locations. Rules governed the engagement, how many warriors each side could field, What weapons were acceptable, how long the battle would last. Historians still argue whether these rules were strictly enforced or more like guidelines that could be bent. But the fundamental principle remained. This was ritualized warfare, combat with cosmic rather than political objectives. Here's the quirky detail that reveals just how formalized these battles became. Diplomatic protocols existed for declaring a flower war. Ambassadors would be exchanged. Messages carved into wood or painted in codices would specify the date, location, and terms of engagement. It was war by appointment, military conflict with the civilized veneer of a diplomatic summit. Imagine receiving a message from your traditional enemy that essentially said, "We'd like to schedule a battle for next month. Does Tuesday work for your army? We're thinking around midday and we'll bring about 2,000 warriors. Let us know." It transforms warfare from chaos into bureaucracy, which is somehow both more rational and more disturbing. The actual combat, when it occurred, followed different rules than wars of conquest. The primary weapon was the macuahuitl, that wooden club embedded with razor-sharp obsidian blades. But warriors wielded them in ways designed to wound and disable, rather than kill outright. A killing blow to the head or neck was considered wasteful. The goal was to injure your opponent enough that he couldn't effectively fight back, then tackle him and bind his arms. Multiple warriors would work together to overwhelm and capture a single enemy. Success was measured not in bodies left on the battlefield, but in prisoners dragged away alive. Warriors who captured enemies during flower wars gained tremendous prestige. Your social status in Aztec society was largely determined by how many captives you'd taken in combat. Capture one prisoner, and you received certain privileges: better clothing, the right to wear specific ornaments, an improved position in religious ceremonies. Capture 4 or more, and you could join the elite military orders of the Jaguar or Eagle Knights, with all the wealth, power, and respect that came with those ranks. The Flower Wars created a meritocratic ladder where martial skill translated directly into social advancement. It was ambitious young men's path to upward mobility, assuming they survived. But the system created strange incentives that distorted combat in ways that would horrify modern military strategists. Warriors sometimes found themselves competing with their own comrades rather than cooperating against the enemy. If 2 Aztec warriors simultaneously grabbed the same Tlaxcalan enemy, a dispute would erupt over who got credit for the capture. Meanwhile, the supposedly captured enemy might escape in the confusion. Battles could devolve into chaotic scrums where everyone was trying to subdue everyone else, while avoiding being subdued themselves, like a massive game of tag where being it meant eventual sacrifice on a pyramid. The Tlaxcalans, despite being on the receiving end of Aztec demands for sacrifice victims, participated in these flower wars for their own complex reasons. Yes, they lost warriors to capture and subsequent sacrifice, but they also captured Aztec warriors who would be sacrificed in Tlaxcalan temples to Tlaxcalan gods. The exchange was roughly balanced. Both sides bled, both sides fed their deities. Moreover, participation in flower wars allowed Tlaxcala to maintain political independence while avoiding the full military wrath of the Aztec Empire. Better to lose some warriors in arranged battles than face total conquest and absorption into Aztec territory. Mainstream historical fact. The Tlaxcalan perspective on flower wars is documented in the Lienzo de Tlaxcala and accounts recorded by Spanish friars interviewing Tlaxcalan informants. These sources confirm that flower wars were mutually agreed upon, and that Tlaxcalan warriors captured Aztecs just as Aztecs captured Tlaxcalans, though the power imbalance meant Aztecs probably came out ahead in raw numbers. The symbolism embedded in the name Flower Wars reveals Aztec poetic sensibilities. Flowers represented beauty, nobility, and the temporary nature of existence. Flowers bloom brilliantly but briefly, just as warriors live gloriously but die young. The battlefield was imagined as a garden where warriors blossomed into their fullest potential before being plucked by death or capture. Blood was compared to precious water nourishing the cosmic garden. Death in combat was called Xochimilquistli, the flowery death, considered one of the most honourable ways to die. The Aztecs wrapped their institutionalized violence in layers of aesthetic metaphor, transforming bloodshed into poetry. But beneath the poetic language and religious justification lay some uncomfortable practical realities. The Flower Wars helped maintain military readiness during peacetime. They provided combat training for young warriors who might otherwise have no battle experience before facing a real enemy. They allowed the empire to identify talented fighters who could be promoted into leadership positions. They kept subject peoples reminded of Aztec military power without the expense and disruption of actual conquest. In other words, the Flower Wars served perfectly rational military and political purposes that had nothing to do with feeding the gods and everything to do with maintaining imperial dominance. The theology might have been genuine, but it also conveniently aligned with strategic interests, a pattern you might recognize from other civilizations throughout history. The system began breaking down in the early 1500s as Spanish arrival destabilized the entire region. When Cortés landed in 1519, he quickly recognized that Tlaxcala and other city-states resented Aztec dominance despite, or perhaps because of, the Flower War arrangements. He exploited these resentments brilliantly, forging alliances with Tlaxcala and other Aztec rivals who saw the Spanish as potential liberators rather than new conquerors. The Tlaxcalans, who'd spent decades fighting Aztecs in ritualized flower wars, eagerly joined Spanish forces to fight Aztecs in actual wars of conquest. The old rules evaporated. Combat became about killing rather than capturing, about destroying the Aztec Empire rather than maintaining ritualized balance with it. Do you remember the gladiator sacrifice where captured warriors fought impossible odds on the stone platform? The Flower Wars were the supply chain that fed that ritual. Do you remember those thousands of skulls arranged on the Tzompantli? Many of them came from Flower War captives. These rituals interconnected, each feeding into the others, creating a comprehensive system where warfare, religion, social mobility, and political control merged into a single complex whole. The Aztecs didn't separate these domains. A Flower War battle was simultaneously military training, religious service, social competition, diplomatic negotiation, and entertainment spectacle. Every arrow had multiple targets. Every captured warrior served multiple purposes. You're standing at the base of the Templo Mayor, and a procession of priests is ascending the steep steps, dragging a captive warrior between them. The drums are thundering now, so loud you feel them in your bones. Shell trumpets wail. Thousands of people crowd the plaza, their faces turned upward toward the pyramid's summit where the sacrifice will occur. You've witnessed many ceremonies during your time in Tenochtitlan, but you've never been close enough to see the actual moment of heart extraction, the central, defining act of Aztec religious practice. Today that changes. Today you climb the pyramid yourself as part of the crowd of witnesses, and you'll see exactly how the priests perform the operation that Spanish chroniclers described with horrified fascination, and that modern people struggle to comprehend. This is the technique at the dark heart of Aztec spirituality, the moment when theology becomes surgery and religion becomes blood. The captive reaches the summit, and immediately 4 priests seize him. These aren't random temple attendants, they're highly trained specialists called tlamakasqui, men who've spent years learning the precise physical techniques required for sacrifice. Each priest grabs a limb, one on the left arm, one on the right, one on the left leg, one on the right. They lift the captive and bend him backward over the tek cattle, the sacrificial stone, which is carved to create a convex surface that arches the victim's chest upward and spreads the ribs apart. The position is crucial. Without it, the heart would be shielded by the rib cage and sternum, making extraction nearly impossible. The high priest, called the Tlatoani, or fire serpent priest, steps forward with the obsidian knife. Now, obsidian is volcanic glass, and when properly knapped, it can be sharpened to an edge only a few molecules thick, sharper than modern surgical steel. But it's also brittle. Drop it and it shatters. Strike bone wrong and the blade chips or breaks. Using an obsidian knife for heart extraction requires not just knowledge of anatomy but exceptional skill with a difficult tool. The high priests who performed these operations were essentially surgeon executioners, masters of a craft that demanded precision, speed, and steady nerves. The priest places his hand on the captive's chest, feeling for landmarks. He's locating the xiphoid process, that small piece of cartilage at the bottom of the sternum, and the space just below it where the abdominal cavity meets the thoracic cavity. This is the vulnerable point where the diaphragm attaches, where there's no bone protecting the organs beneath. Historians still argue about whether Aztec priests understood anatomy in the modern scientific sense, but clearly they'd developed empirical knowledge through thousands of repetitions. They knew where to cut. The knife plunges in just below the sternum, angled upward and slightly to the left. The initial cut is surprisingly small, only about 4 inches long, but it penetrates deep, through skin, through muscle, through the diaphragm into the thoracic cavity itself. Blood immediately flows, but not the arterial spray you might imagine. The captive, bent backward over the stone with massive pressure on his chest and unable to breathe properly, is probably already losing consciousness from oxygen deprivation. The body's going into shock. The heart, sensing crisis, beats frantically. Here's where the real skill comes in. The priest doesn't simply stab wildly into the chest cavity. He inserts his hand, his actual hand, into the wound, reaching up behind the sternum, feeling for the heart. His fingers find the pericardium, the membranous sac that surrounds the heart, and tear through it. Then his hand closes around the heart itself, that fist-sized muscle that's been beating without pause since before the captive was born, and which is now beating its final desperate rhythms. The priest cuts the major vessels, the aorta, the vena cava, the pulmonary arteries and veins, severing the heart's connections to the rest of the circulatory system. This requires multiple cuts in confined space, reaching upward into the chest cavity with the obsidian blade while still gripping the heart. Get the angles wrong and you cut your own hand, miss the vessels and you're just hacking blindly. But the experienced priest could do this in seconds. Spanish chronicler Bernardino de Sahagún wrote that the entire process from initial cut to heart extraction took less than a minute, often just 30 or 40 seconds. That's astonishing speed for such a complex operation, performed without anesthesia, proper lighting, or modern surgical instruments. With the vessel severed, the priest pulls the heart out through the original incision. The heart is still beating. This detail appears in every eyewitness account, emphasized with obvious horror. The priest holds it aloft and the crowd sees the heart contracting rhythmically in his bloodied hand, pumping futilely without any body to feed. The sight must have been simultaneously awesome and terrible, proof that the life force was being transferred directly from victim to gods, that the moment of death was visible and undeniable. The priest then places the still beating heart in a ceremonial vessel called a coax, literally eagle's vase, often carved to resemble an eagle or jaguar. The heart continues to beat for perhaps 30 seconds or a minute more before finally stopping. Meanwhile, the captive's body, now heartless, is released by the 4 assistant priests. It tumbles down the pyramid steps, blood marking its descent, until it reaches the bottom where other priests or warriors collect it for further ritual use. Different sacrifices had different purposes for the body. Sometimes the corpse would be butchered and distributed to warriors who'd participated in the captive's capture. Yes, ritual cannibalism occurred, though scholars debate its prevalence and exact meaning. Other times the body would be flayed for skin-wearing ceremonies, as you witnessed during Tlacaxi-Pehualiztli. Nothing was wasted. Mainstream historical fact: archaeological evidence from the Templo Maya includes multiple Quauxicali vessels with residue testing positive for human blood, plus the obsidian blades described in chronicles. Chemical analysis of sacrificial stones shows organic residues consistent with the described practices. This isn't speculation or propaganda, it's verified through material evidence. Here's the quirky detail that shows how normalized this was. The high priest who performed heart extractions did so multiple times per day during major festivals. Records suggest that at the dedication of the enlarged Templo Maya in 1487, thousands of captives were sacrificed over 4 days. Even accounting for Spanish exaggeration, and they certainly exaggerated, we're still talking about hundreds of operations performed in rapid succession. The priests weren't performing careful, contemplative rituals for each individual. They were working an assembly line of death, developing the kind of muscle memory that comes from endless repetition. They were probably as emotionally detached as modern slaughterhouse workers or surgeons in a busy emergency room, focused on technical proficiency, not emotional engagement with each individual case. The psychological mechanisms that allowed priests to perform these operations day after day deserve consideration. They clearly believed the sacrifices were necessary to maintain cosmic order. The sun needed blood to fuel its daily journey across the sky. The earth needed nourishment to produce crops. The gods had sacrificed themselves to create humanity, and humans owed a blood debt in return. Within this worldview, heart extraction wasn't murder. It was feeding the forces that sustained all existence. The priest's role wasn't executioner but mediator, facilitating the transfer of life energy from the terrestrial realm to the divine realm. Spanish observers tried to understand the priest's psychology, and mostly failed, projecting their own categories onto behaviours that made sense only within Aztec cosmology. Some Spaniards described the priests as demonic, possessed by Satan, consciously serving evil. Others portrayed them as deluded by false gods, sincere but tragically misguided. Few managed to grasp that from the priest's perspective, they were performing the most sacred duty possible, the work that literally kept the universe functioning. Stop the sacrifices and the sun might not rise. Stop feeding the gods and the world might end. The weight of cosmic responsibility made the psychological burden of killing not lighter, but somehow bearable, even necessary. Modern people often ask, did the victims struggle? Did they scream? Did they try to escape? The accounts vary, suggesting different responses from different individuals. Some captives, raised in similar Mesoamerican cultures, apparently accepted their fate with stoic resignation, or even pride. They'd been taught from childhood that death by sacrifice was honourable, that it guaranteed passage to the highest heaven. Others, particularly victims from cultures without these beliefs, presumably fought and screamed and had to be subdued by force. The 4 assistant priests weren't just holding the victim in position, they were restraining someone who might thrash and struggle with the desperation that comes from knowing you have seconds to live. The physical realities of heart extraction also challenge our sanitized modern relationship with death. We're accustomed to death happening in hospitals, managed by professionals, hidden behind curtains and closed doors. The Aztecs performed their deaths in public, on pyramid summits visible throughout the city, with blood flowing down architectural channels designed specifically for that purpose. They forced their citizens, including children, to witness, to understand, to internalize the brutal fact that life requires death, that the gods demand blood, that this is the price of cosmic continuation. Whether this created a more or less psychologically healthy relationship with mortality is a question historians still argue about, with no clear answers. Do you remember watching the Xiptla climb the pyramid, breaking his clay flutes with each step, ascending toward his willing death? That sacrifice was singular, ceremonial, built up over a year of preparation. The daily heart extractions were different, industrial, efficient, repeated dozens or hundreds of times during major festivals. Both were sacrifices, both involved heart extraction, but they occupied different psychological and ritual spaces. The Aztecs maintained room for both the individualized sacred death and the mass production of offerings, suggesting a theological sophistication that recognized different types of sacrifice served different spiritual needs. You're sitting in a temple courtyard during a quiet evening ceremony, and a noble kneels before the altar. There are no drums thundering, no crowds gathering, no captives being dragged up pyramid steps. This is a different kind of sacrifice entirely, intimate, personal, and self-inflicted. The noble unwraps a small bundle containing maguey thorns, stingray spines, and obsidian blades. He places a woven mat beneath himself to catch the blood that's about to flow. Then, with practiced movements that suggest he's done this many times before, he pierces his own tongue with a stingray spine, drawing it through the flesh until blood streams down his chin and drips onto bark paper arranged on the mat below. This is auto-sacrifice, self-bloodletting, and it's one of the most common yet least discussed rituals in Aztec religious life, the everyday devotion that counterbalanced the spectacular public sacrifices you've been witnessing. Auto-sacrifice was ubiquitous in Aztec society, practiced by everyone from the emperor to common farmers, from high priests to merchants. The underlying theology was consistent with the larger sacrificial complex. The gods had bled to create humanity and the universe, therefore humans owed blood in return. But clearly the Empire couldn't sacrifice everyone, nor would it make sense to kill the population that sustained the civilization. Auto-sacrifice offered a compromise. You could offer your blood without offering your life, could participate in the cosmic maintenance program without dying in the process. It was sacrifice on a payment plan rather than as a lump sum. The most common form involved the tongue, that organ of speech and taste and communication. Nobles and priests would pierce their tongues with maguey thorns, those sharp spines from agave plants, or with stingray spines imported from the coast at considerable expense. The tongue is richly supplied with blood vessels, so even a small puncture produces impressive bleeding. The practitioner would often thread a cord through the hole, pulling it back and forth to maximize blood flow, letting the blood drip onto bark paper that would later be burned as an offering. The papers were sometimes arranged in specific patterns or quantities with different numbers of bloodied sheets appropriate for different petitions or different gods. Ears were another popular target for auto-sacrifice. The earlobe is easily accessible, relatively painless to pierce, and bleeds readily. People would puncture their earlobes repeatedly, sometimes creating rows of holes that bled simultaneously, the blood flowing down their necks and staining their clothing. The visible bloodstain served as public proof of devotion. You couldn't fake auto-sacrifice because the evidence literally wore on your body. Scarred earlobes, tongues marked with old puncture wounds, and fingers bearing the traces of countless cuts all testified to a person's religious commitment. But the most intense form of auto-sacrifice involved the genitals. Yes, you read that correctly. Aztec nobles, particularly men, though some accounts mention women performing similar practices with different anatomy, would pierce their penises with maguey thorns or obsidian blades, drawing blood from what must have been agonizingly sensitive tissue. Historians still argue about exactly how common this practice was. Some chronicles suggest it happened only during extreme circumstances, droughts, military defeats, or other crises that demanded extraordinary devotion. Other sources imply it was a regular practice for the highest-ranking nobles and priests, performed monthly or even more frequently. Here's the quirky detail that reveals just how systematized this practice became. Special ritual tools existed specifically for auto-sacrifice. Archaeological excavations have uncovered elaborate bloodletting kits, ornate boxes containing stingray spines, obsidian blades of various sizes, and maguey thorns, sometimes arranged in graduated sizes like a macabre version of a sewing kit. The stingray spines were particularly prized because their serrated edges ensured maximum blood flow. Some surviving examples show beautiful carved handles, turning instruments of self-mutilation into works of art. The Aztecs aestheticized their pain, made beauty from blood, transformed suffering into craft. The timing and frequency of auto-sacrifice varied based on social position and religious calendar. Priests performed bloodletting daily as part of their regular duties. Before dawn, they'd ascend the pyramids and pierce their earlobes, letting blood fall as an offering to the rising sun. Nobles were expected to perform auto-sacrifice during major festivals and before important political or military decisions. Commoners participated less frequently but still regularly, perhaps monthly, or during agricultural ceremonies tied to planting and harvest. The practice created a kind of blood tax that everyone paid, redistributing the sacrificial burden across the entire population, rather than concentrating it on the unlucky few who ended up having their hearts removed. The psychological aspects of repeated self-mutilation are complex and disturbing. Modern people who engage in self-harm typically do so because of psychological distress, trauma, or mental illness. But Aztec auto-sacrifice operated in an entirely different context. This wasn't pathology, it was piety. It wasn't self-destruction, it was self-offering. The pain was intentional and meaningful, not a symptom to be treated, but a spiritual tool to be employed. People likely experienced endorphin rushes from the pain, creating a physiological reinforcement loop that made the practice feel spiritually significant. The blood loss might have induced lightheadedness that was interpreted as closeness to the divine. The visible wounds demonstrated devotion to your community and gods. Mainstream historical fact. The Florentine Codex contains multiple illustrations showing auto-sacrifice practices, including detailed depictions of nobles piercing their tongues, ears, and genitals. Diego Duran's chronicle describes witnessing bloodletting ceremonies and notes the elaborate rituals surrounding collection of the blood. Archaeological evidence includes the bloodletting kits mentioned earlier, plus residues on ritual objects consistent with the described practices. The blood collected during auto-sacrifice wasn't just allowed to drip randomly. It was gathered purposefully on special bark papers called a myrtle. These papers would be carefully folded or arranged, sometimes formed into shapes representing gods or cosmic forces, then burned in ceremonial fires. The smoke carrying the blood skyward represented the offering reaching its divine recipients. Other times, the bloodied papers would be buried at sacred locations, under temple foundations, in caves, at mountain tops, leaving permanent markers of devotion embedded in the landscape. Some auto-sacrifice ceremonies involved competitive elements that reveal a fascinating intersection of piety and pride. During certain festivals, nobles would gather and perform bloodletting in public, with observers essentially judging who could produce the most blood, endure the most pain, or perform the act with the greatest dignity and composure. Winning, if that's the right word, brought social prestige and demonstrated superior devotion. It was religious one-upmanship, spiritual competition, a contest to see who could hurt themselves most impressively for the gods. The combination of sincere faith and social maneuvering is very human and somewhat relatable. People have always found ways to turn religious observance into status competition. Children were initiated into auto-sacrifice practices gradually. Young children might be taught to prick their fingers with small thorns, learning the basic techniques in contexts that produced minimal pain and blood. As they grew older, the expectations increased. Deeper punctures, more sensitive locations, greater quantities of blood. By adulthood, the practice was so normalized that it probably felt no stranger than any other religious obligation. You prayed, you fasted, you made offerings, and you bled. These were simply what devotion looked like. The Spanish, predictably, were horrified by auto-sacrifice, seeing it as evidence of demonic influence and religious delusion. The Catholic tradition had its own history of self-flagellation and ascetic practices, saints who wore hair shirts, monks who beat themselves with whips, mystics who denied themselves food and comfort. But tongue-piercing and genital mutilation apparently crossed a line. The friars who documented these practices couldn't reconcile the Aztecs' obvious intelligence and sophisticated culture with behaviours they considered primitive and savage. It created cognitive dissonance that many solved by deciding the Aztecs were seduced by Satan, needing salvation through forced conversion. Yet from the Aztec perspective, the Spanish seemed bizarrely squeamish about blood. How could these foreigners claim to be so pious when they refused to offer their own blood to their god? The Spanish talked about Christ's sacrifice on the cross, but that was something that happened long ago to someone else. Where was the personal sacrifice, the immediate offering of self in the present moment? The cultural clash worked both ways, with each side finding the other's religious practices simultaneously fascinating and incomprehensible. Do you remember the children weeping as they were led to drowning, their tears meant to summon rain? Auto-sacrifice offered an inverted image, adults willingly inflicting pain on themselves, their blood meant to nourish the cosmos. Both practices rested on the same theological foundation. The gods require offerings, and those offerings must involve genuine sacrifice, whether life itself or the pain and blood of the living. The Aztecs maintained a comprehensive sacrificial economy where everyone participated according to their station and circumstances. Some gave their lives, others gave their blood, but everyone gave something, maintaining their part in the cosmic contract that kept the universe functioning. You're standing before the Templo Mayor, the Great Temple, in the heart of Tenochtitlan, and you're trying to comprehend something that initially seems impossible. This massive structure, this architectural mountain that dominates the city's sacred precinct, isn't a single building constructed all at once. It's actually 7 pyramids built one on top of another over approximately 200 years, each generation of Aztec rulers commissioning a larger temple to encase the previous one like the layers of an onion. And buried within those layers, sealed inside the pyramid's expanding body, are some of the most extraordinary caches of ritual offerings ever discovered. Children, jaguars, crocodiles, eagles, and objects transported from the farthest reaches of the known world, all placed there to sanctify the structure and bind the cosmos together through carefully calculated acts of sacred burial. The Templo Mayor wasn't just a building, it was a microcosm of the Aztec universe, a symbolic representation of cosmic geography made physical. The pyramid itself represented Coatepec, the snake mountain where the god Huitzilopochtli was born in mythological time. The temple at the summit actually contained 2 shrines side by side, one dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, god of war and the sun painted red, the other dedicated to Tlaloc, god of rain and agriculture painted blue. The duality was intentional: war and agriculture, sun and rain, fire and water, all the complementary opposites that kept the universe in balance. Walking around the Templo Mayor meant walking through Aztec theology made tangible. Construction of each successive pyramid followed elaborate ceremonies that transformed building into ritual. Before laying new foundations, priests would perform extensive divinations to ensure the gods approved. Offerings would be made to the earth itself, asking permission to disturb the ground and construct something new. Then came the sacrifice, not just of humans, though certainly humans were included, but of animals, objects, and substances meant to encode meaning into the structure's very fabric. These weren't decorations or afterthoughts. They were essential to the building's spiritual function, the glue that bound the physical and metaphysical together. Archaeological excavations beginning in 1978, when electrical workers accidentally discovered part of the temple complex beneath Mexico City streets, have revealed over 200 offering caches buried within the Templo Mayor's layers. Each cache tells a story, contains a message in the language of sacred objects and sacrificed beings. Cache 7, discovered in 1978, contained the remains of 42 children buried at the corners of the temple expansion, their small skeletons arranged in specific patterns. These weren't random burials. They were architectural elements as essential as the stones themselves, tiny beings whose deaths consecrated the corners and connected the building to the gods, particularly Tlaloc, who demanded children's tears and lives. Other caches contained jaguars and eagles, the 2 animals most sacred to the Aztecs and representatives of their elite military orders. But these weren't just bones thrown in pits. The animals had been ritually killed, dressed in elaborate costumes and buried with ceremony-matching human sacrifices. Jaguar skeletons wearing jade bead necklaces, eagle bones surrounded by obsidian blades, crocodile remains positioned to face specific cardinal directions. Each animal carried symbolic weight. Jaguars represented the earth and night, eagles represented the sun and day, crocodiles embodied the earth's surface floating on the primordial waters. Burying them within the pyramid created a kind of cosmic atlas, mapping the universe's structure into the building's body. Historians still argue about the logistics of acquiring some of the objects found in the caches. The Templo Mayor offerings include marine shells from both the Pacific and Atlantic coasts, hundreds of miles away in different directions, jade from Guatemala, amber from Chiapas, coral, unusual stones, exotic woods from tropical regions the Aztecs had never directly conquered. The effort required to gather these materials was staggering. Merchants called Pochteca travelled for months or years, trading through multiple intermediary peoples to acquire the specific shells or stones that priests required for offerings. The economic investment in a single offering cache could have fed a neighbourhood for months. But this was considered money well spent, investing in the god's satisfaction, ensuring the temple's spiritual power. Here's the quirky detail that reveals the Aztecs' attention to symbolic detail. Many offering caches were arranged in patterns that encoded numbers sacred in Aztec cosmology. 4 objects representing the 4 cardinal directions, 9 items for the 9 levels of the underworld, 13 pieces for the 13 levels of the heavens, 20 elements for the 20 day signs in the calendar. 52 components for the calendar round. The priests weren't just tossing valuable objects into pits. They were composing 3-dimensional mathematical poems, theological equations written in bones and stones and shells. Each cache was a message in a symbolic language that spoke to the gods in terms they would understand. The human remains in the foundation caches show evidence of specific ritual treatment before burial. Some children were dressed in elaborate costumes and adorned with jewellery, suggesting they were given the full ceremonial treatment before sacrifice. Others show evidence of having been ritually positioned, arms crossed, legs folded, bodies oriented to face certain directions. The care taken with these burials indicates the Aztecs didn't see them as simple victims, but as sacred ambassadors being sent into the temple's heart to maintain permanent contact between the structure and divine forces. They were spiritual infrastructure, as essential to the temple's function as support beams and foundation stones. Mainstream historical fact. The Templo Mayor Museum in Mexico City displays hundreds of artifacts from the archaeological excavations, including complete offering caches that can be viewed exactly as they were discovered. Scientific analysis of the materials confirms they come from regions throughout Mesoamerica, with some objects originating over 1,000 miles from Tenochtitlan. The human remains have been extensively studied, confirming sacrificial patterns described in Spanish chronicles. The Spanish, when they arrived and learned about the offerings buried within the pyramid, were somewhat baffled by the practice. They understood foundation sacrifices. European tradition included occasionally burying objects under new buildings for luck or divine favour, but the scale and complexity of Aztec offerings exceeded anything in their experience. When they tore down the Templo Mayor stone by stone to build Mexico City's metropolitan cathedral, they encountered cache after cache, bones and jade and shells cascading from the pyramid's interior like some ancient piñata filled with death and treasure. Many of these offerings were scattered, destroyed or looted, their meanings lost forever when the contexts were disrupted. The practice of burying offerings within expanding temple structures created an interesting architectural effect. The Templo Mayor was a building that contained its own history, its own previous versions sealed within its body like tree rings. Walking around the temple's exterior in Aztec times meant walking around the newest version. But inside, invisible to observers, were the older temples with their older offerings, creating a kind of temporal archaeology where past and present coexisted in the same space. The newest outer shell was contemporary Aztec reality, but deeper inside were the offerings from the empire's earlier days, when it was smaller, poorer, less powerful, but equally devoted to feeding its gods. The dedication ceremony when a new expansion was completed involved massive sacrifices meant to consecrate the new structure. Chronicles describe the rededication of the enlarged Templo Mayor in 1487 under the Emperor Ahuitzotl as involving the sacrifice of thousands. Spanish sources claim as many as 80,000, Though modern scholars consider this wildly exaggerated and suggest numbers in the hundreds or low thousands, still, even accounting for exaggeration, we're talking about dedication ceremonies that involved days of continuous sacrifice, priests working in shifts to keep the hearts flowing, bodies tumbling down the pyramid steps until they were slick with blood. The goal was to announce to the gods and to rival city-states that the Aztec Empire had reached a new peak of power and could offer tribute on a scale that demonstrated its dominance. Think about what it meant to live in Tenochtitlan and watch your central religious monument growing larger every few decades. The expanding pyramid visibly demonstrated imperial growth, the increase in wealth and power that allowed for bigger buildings and more elaborate ceremonies. But it also meant that the spiritual infrastructure of your world was literally expanding, that the cosmic connection point linking Earth and sky was getting stronger, more elaborate, more capable of handling the increased sacrificial traffic. The Templo Mayor's growth was physical proof that the Aztec way of life was working, that the gods were satisfied, that the universe would continue because the sacrifices continued on an ever grander scale. Do you remember the skull racks displaying thousands of deaths transformed into architecture? The Templo Mayor represents a related impulse, death built into structure, sacrifice made permanent, theology encoded into stone and bone. But where the Tzompantli displayed death publicly, the offering caches buried death secretly, hiding sacred violence within the building's heart where only the gods could see. Both approaches made death constructive rather than merely destructive, transforming killing into building, violence into architecture, sacrifice into the literal foundation of civilization. The Aztecs were builders and destroyers simultaneously, and they saw no contradiction in that duality. You're walking through Tenochtitlan during the harvest season, and there's a woman moving through the crowds who draws everyone's attention. She's dressed in elaborate ceremonial garments representing the maize goddess Tosi, the Earth Mother, grandmother of the gods. Her face is painted with sacred designs. She wears a headdress of maize stalks and flowers. Musicians accompany her, playing flutes and drums in rhythms that echo the agricultural cycle. Planting, growing, ripening, harvest. Children follow her through the streets, tossing flower petals in her path. For the past several days she's been honoured as a living goddess, fed the finest foods, treated with reverence by everyone she encounters. But tonight, at midnight, during the festival of Ochpanistli, the sweeping of the road, she will be led to the temple, and in absolute darkness and silence, her head will be severed from her body, so that her blood can nourish the earth before the harvest begins. The Ochpanistli festival marked a critical transition in the agricultural calendar, the moment between the growing season and the harvest when the earth needed to be thanked for its abundance and prepared to give up its fruit. The ritual personification of the maize goddess by a living woman made this transition tangible, gave it human form, created a being who embodied the cycle of growth and death that governed agricultural life. She wasn't just representing the goddess. In Aztec theological understanding, she had become the goddess. Her identity temporarily merged with the divine force she embodied. The selection process for this role was careful and specific. The woman chosen as Tosi's exceptler needed to be past childbearing age, typically a woman in her 40s or 50s, because Tosi was the grandmother goddess, the ancient earth mother who'd given birth to all other deities. Youth would have been theologically inappropriate. She needed certain physical characteristics and, ideally, a disposition suited to the role's demands. Unlike the young man chosen to represent Tezcatlipoca, who lived as a god for an entire year, the woman representing Tosi served for only about 8 days. But those 8 days were intense, transformative, and inevitably fatal. During her time as the goddess, the Exipla participated in elaborate ceremonies throughout the city. She visited markets where vendors would offer her gifts and prostrate themselves. She travelled to temples where priests performed rituals in her honour. Women, particularly those involved in agricultural work or seeking fertility blessings, would approach her with petitions and offerings. She blessed seeds that would be planted for the next growing cycle. She touched the bellies of pregnant women, transferring the goddess's power to ensure safe childbirth. Her presence was believed to literally concentrate divine feminine creative energy wherever she went. The festival's name, Oshpanistli, the sweeping of the road, refers to the ritual cleaning performed throughout the city during this period. Every street, every plaza, every temple courtyard was swept clean of debris and dirt. The sweeping wasn't just practical hygiene, it was symbolic purification, clearing away the spiritual detritus of the old agricultural cycle to make space for the new. Women led the sweeping ceremonies, emphasizing the connection between feminine labor, cleanliness, and agricultural renewal. The Exipla would sometimes participate in the sweeping herself, the goddess cleaning her own domain, preparing the earth for its coming transformation. Here's the quirky detail that shows the complexity of Aztec ritual thought. The Exipla was forbidden to know the exact moment of her death. Throughout the 8-day festival, she was treated with honor, but also carefully managed to prevent her from learning the specific timing of the sacrifice. The element of surprise was considered theologically essential. If she knew when death was coming, she might become frightened or resistant, might psychologically separate herself from the goddess role she was inhabiting. The surprise ensured she remained in character until the absolute final moment, maintaining the divine identification that made the sacrifice cosmically effective. On the final night, the Exipla was led to the temple at midnight. The city fell silent. No drums, no singing, no crowds. This sacrifice was different from the public spectacles you've witnessed on pyramid summits in daylight. This was intimate, hidden, performed in darkness. The silence and darkness represented the earth itself. Quiet, dark, mysterious. The hidden realm where seeds germinate and roots grow. The goddess needed to return to that darkness to complete the agricultural cycle. The method of death was also unique. Rather than the standard heart extraction, the Exipla was beheaded. A priest would approach from behind as she faced the altar, and with a single stroke of a sharp blade would sever her head from her body. The beheading had to be sudden, clean, and complete. The severed head was immediately raised toward the sky, the blood from the neck spraying upward in an arc that represented the goddess's blood returning to heaven, while simultaneously raining down on the earth below. The body, now headless, would collapse forward over the altar, the remaining blood pouring out to directly nourish the earth. Historians still argue about why beheading was chosen for this particular sacrifice rather than heart extraction. The most compelling theory connects it to agricultural metaphors. Maize plants are harvested by cutting. You sever the stalk to gather the ears. The act of beheading the goddess mirrored the act of harvesting crops, creating a sympathetic magic connection between the sacrifice and the agricultural work it was meant to bless. The goddess was being harvested like grain, and in her harvesting she blessed all the grain harvest that would follow. Immediately after the beheading, the priest would flay the skin from the Exiptla's thigh, just the thigh, not the entire body as in the Sipe Totec ceremonies you witnessed earlier. This piece of skin was treated with extraordinary care, cleaned and prepared, then given to a young priest or noble warrior who would wear it on his own thigh for the remainder of the festival. The skin wearing symbolized the transfer of the goddess's power, her generative force, from the sacrificed woman to a representative who would carry that energy through the completion of the harvest season. The wearer became a living amulet, a vessel of agricultural blessing moving through the community. Mainstream historical fact. The Florentine Codex provides detailed descriptions of the Ochpanistli ceremony across multiple chapters, including the specific methods of sacrifice and the ritual use of the thigh skin. Diego Duran's chronicle independently corroborates most of these details, suggesting this wasn't invented propaganda, but an actual practice documented by multiple witnesses. The choice of a woman to embody the earth goddess and the specific ritual elements of her sacrifice reflected Aztec gender cosmology in fascinating ways. Women were associated with earth, fertility, nourishment, and the hidden processes of growth. Men were associated with sky, warfare, the sun, and visible public action. The agricultural cycle required both: the earth to receive and nurture, the sun to warm and ripen. But at the crucial harvest moment, it was the feminine principle that needed to die and be reborn. The earth that needed to be cut and bled so its abundance could be gathered. The ritual made these abstract cosmological principles tangible through a woman's body, her death, and her blood. The psychological experience of the Ixtla during those 8 days must have been extraordinary and terrible. Imagine being treated as a goddess, worshipped and honoured, while simultaneously, at some level you might not consciously acknowledge but surely sensed, knowing that this honour was temporary, that it was building towards something final. Did she believe she was truly becoming the goddess, her personality merging with the divine identity? Did she retain her individual consciousness while performing the goddess role, aware of the separation between self and character? Did the surprise of the midnight beheading come as complete shock, or had some part of her been expecting it, dreading it, preparing for it throughout the festival? The aftermath of the sacrifice followed agricultural logic. The Ixtla's blood was collected and mixed with maize dough, creating a sacred substance that would be distributed to farmers and used in subsequent planting ceremonies. Her body, minus the thigh skin, was treated with the same reverence given to any important sacrifice, either buried in sacred locations or distributed according to ritual protocols. Her head, like other sacrificial victims' heads, might eventually find its way to the Tzompantli, her skull joining the thousands of others in that vast monument of death made visible. The festival concluded with massive communal feasting and celebration. The danger point had been passed. The goddess had died and been reborn. The agricultural cycle had completed and begun again. The harvest could proceed with divine blessing. Women who'd participated in the sweeping ceremonies were honoured. New priestesses were initiated into service. Young girls were symbolically married to the maize god in ceremonies that blessed their future fertility. The death of the goddess woman enabled all this life, all this celebration, all this continuation. Her sacrifice was the hinge on which the seasonal door swung from growing to harvesting. Do you remember the children crying as they approached their drowning, their tears meant to summon rain at the season's beginning? The Ochpanistli sacrifice offered a dark mirror, an older woman dying as the season reached its culmination, her blood blessing the harvest those early rains had made possible. The agricultural year was bracketed by sacrifices, beginning with children for water and ending with a woman for earth, the cycle of life requiring death at both ends to maintain its continuance. The Aztecs saw no way around this equation. The gods gave life, but they demanded death in return. The earth produced abundance, but it required blood to maintain its generosity. These weren't metaphors or symbols. They were, in Aztec understanding, the literal mechanics of cosmic sustainability. You're sitting in a temple school where young priests are being educated in theology, and the teacher's explaining something that initially sounds impossible to your modern ears. The universe, he tells his students, has already ended 4 times. 4 previous worlds have existed and been destroyed, each wiped out by cosmic catastrophes, jaguars devouring humanity, hurricanes flattening cities, fire raining from the sky, floods drowning everything. The 5th sun, the current age of which you're living, is itself temporary and will inevitably end in earthquakes that tear the world apart. The only question is when. And the answer to that question depends entirely on whether humanity continues to feed the gods with blood and hearts and lives. Stop the sacrifices and the universe ends immediately. Maintain them, and the world continues for another day, another year, another generation. This is the cosmic worldview that justified every ritual you've witnessed, the theological foundation that made skull racks and heart extractions and child sacrifices not only acceptable, but absolutely necessary. The Aztec creation mythology was recorded in multiple sources, most completely in documents like the Legend of the Suns and accounts gathered by Spanish chroniclers from indigenous informants. According to these cosmological narratives, the gods gathered at Teotihuacan, the ancient ruined city the Aztecs discovered and considered sacred, to create the 5th sun. The previous 4 ages had failed for various reasons, and the gods needed to try again. But creating a new sun required sacrifice. One god would need to throw himself into a cosmic fire to be transformed into the sun itself. Another would need to follow to become the moon. Without their deaths, the new age couldn't begin. 2 gods volunteered. Tenochtitlan, a wealthy, proud deity who offered himself first, and Nanahuatzin, a humble god covered in sores and pustules. When the moment came to leap into the flames, Tenochtitlan hesitated, afraid of the pain. Nanahuatzin, without hesitation, threw himself into the fire and was transformed into the blazing sun. Shamed by the humble god's courage, Tenochtitlan finally followed and became the moon, though dimmer than the sun because of his cowardice. But even after their transformation, the sun and moon remained motionless in the sky. The other gods realized that more sacrifice was required, so all the remaining gods agreed to die, offering their hearts and blood to set the celestial bodies in motion. Their collective sacrifice birthed the movement of time itself, the progression of days and nights that defines existence. This origin story encoded several crucial theological principles that governed Aztec ritual practice. First, creation requires sacrifice. Nothing comes into existence without something else dying. Second, the gods themselves sacrificed to create humanity, establishing a cosmic debt that humans could never fully repay, but were obligated to service continuously. Third, the universe is fundamentally unstable and requires constant maintenance through blood offerings to prevent its collapse. Fourth, courage and willingness to sacrifice are more important than wealth or status. Nanahuatzin's humble bravery mattered more than Tenochtitlan's proud hesitation. The 4 previous ages, called suns, each ended catastrophically, and these endings carried moral lessons about cosmic fragility. The first sun was destroyed when jaguars descended and devoured all humans. The second sun ended when hurricanes swept everything away. The third sun was consumed by fire raining from the heavens. The fourth sun drowned in massive floods. Each destruction represented a failure, a cosmic experiment that didn't work, a world that couldn't sustain itself. The 5th sun, the Nahui Olin or 4-movement era, was destined to end in earthquakes, though exactly when remained uncertain. The Aztecs believed they were living in the final age, the last chance for creation to succeed, and their responsibility to maintain it through sacrifice carried apocalyptic urgency. Here's the quirky detail that shows how this cosmology shaped daily life. The Aztec calendar itself was a constant reminder of cosmic fragility. Every 52 years, during the New Fire ceremony you witnessed at the beginning of this journey, the calendar wheels meshed back to their starting position, and the world might end. Every day bore a name that connected it to the larger cosmic patterns. Some days were auspicious, others dangerous. Every morning when the sun rose, it represented a victory in the nightly battle between light and darkness. The sun was a warrior who fought through the underworld each night and might not emerge victorious each dawn. Nothing was guaranteed. Everything required maintenance. The theological logic extended beyond the sun's daily journey to encompass all natural processes. Rain didn't fall because of atmospheric pressure and moisture condensation. It fell because Tlaloc chose to release it, and he chose to release it because he'd been fed appropriately with child sacrifices. Crops didn't grow through photosynthesis and soil nutrients. They grew because the earth had been nourished with blood, and the gods of agriculture had been properly honoured. Disease didn't spread through infection. It was punishment from displeased gods or attacks from malevolent supernatural forces. Every aspect of existence was personalized, made dependent on divine will, and divine will could be influenced through sacrifice. Historians still argue about whether the Aztec elite, the priests and nobles who received sophisticated educations, genuinely believed in this cosmology literally, or whether they recognized it as metaphorical but useful for maintaining social control. The consensus leans toward genuine belief. The cosmology was too thoroughly integrated into every aspect of Aztec life, too deeply embedded in their mathematics and astronomy and architecture and agriculture, to be mere cynical manipulation. Yes, it served political purposes, justifying warfare, legitimizing the nobility's power, explaining suffering and demanding obedience. But that doesn't mean the believers were insincere. Religious systems often serve multiple purposes simultaneously, and the Aztec cosmic worldview appears to have been sincerely held by nearly everyone in the society, from emperors to farmers. Mainstream historical fact. The cosmological narratives were recorded in multiple independent sources, including indigenous language documents like the Annals of Cuautitlan and Spanish chronicles based on native informants. The consistency across sources suggests these weren't invented by Aztecs trying to please Spanish questioners, but represented actual religious beliefs. Archaeological evidence, including calendar stones and temple alignments, confirms the calendrical and astronomical knowledge encoded in these myths. The emotional weight of living within this worldview must have been crushing. Imagine believing that every sunrise is uncertain, that the universe might end if people stop performing their religious duties, that you personally bear partial responsibility for cosmic maintenance. The anxiety would be extraordinary, and yet the same worldview also provided structure, meaning, and a sense of importance. You weren't just living your small individual life. You were participating in the largest possible project, the continuation of existence itself. Your bloodletting, your attendance at sacrifices, your prayers and offerings all mattered cosmically. You were important because the universe needed you. This cosmic anxiety explains the scale and intensity of Aztec sacrifice in ways that purely political or social explanations cannot. Yes, the sacrificial system served the empire's expansion and maintained hierarchies. but it also reflected genuine terror about cosmic collapse, authentic belief that without constant feeding the gods would abandon humanity and the world would end. The thousands of hearts extracted atop pyramids, the skull racks holding tens of thousands of dead, the constant stream of blood flowing through Tenochtitlan's ceremonial precinct. All of it made sense within a worldview where the alternative was literally the end of everything. The concept of the Xiuhcoatl, the fire serpent or cosmic monster that would devour the sun if not properly opposed, personified this apocalyptic threat. The Aztecs believed that every night when the sun set, it descended into the underworld to fight demons and monsters. The sun needed strength for this nightly battle, and that strength came from consuming the hearts and blood of sacrificial victims. If the sacrifices stopped, the sun would weaken, lose its battles, and fail to rise. Darkness would triumph permanently. The Xiuhcoatl would win. Creation would cease. This wasn't metaphorical. This was physics as the Aztecs understood it, the actual mechanics governing celestial motion and cosmic continuation. The psychological implications of this worldview for sacrificial victims are worth considering. If you'd been raised in Aztec culture and genuinely believed that your death would help prevent the apocalypse, would that make dying easier? Would it provide meaning that made the terror and pain bearable? Some victims apparently achieved this state, accepting their deaths as necessary, even honourable. Others clearly didn't, fighting and screaming and having to be restrained. The worldview didn't automatically produce resigned victims, but it created a context where resigned acceptance was at least possible, where death by sacrifice could be interpreted as the most meaningful death available, the one death that truly mattered on a cosmic scale. The Spanish conquistadors and friars couldn't comprehend this cosmology on its own terms. They interpreted it through Christian categories. The gods were demons, the sacrifices were devil worship, the cosmic anxiety was delusion. They never quite grasped that the Aztecs weren't worshipping evil or celebrating death. They were desperately trying to prevent universal death, working to maintain existence, sacrificing to save rather than destroy. The Spanish saw the blood and concluded the Aztecs were bloodthirsty. They saw the skulls and concluded the Aztecs were death-obsessed. They never understood that from the Aztec perspective, all that blood and death was in service of life, preventing the much greater death that would consume everything if the rituals ceased. Do you remember the new fire ceremony's darkness, the terror that the sun might not return, the relief when the spark caught? That emotional arc, anxiety, action, relief, repeated at every scale in Aztec religious life. Daily prayers carried that pattern. Weekly ceremonies enacted it. Monthly festivals dramatized it. The 52-year cycle made it epical. And underlying everything was the knowledge that despite all these efforts, despite centuries of sacrifice, the fifth sun would eventually end in earthquakes anyway. They were fighting a battle they knew they'd ultimately lose, but fighting it anyway, postponing the inevitable, buying time for their children and grandchildren to live, was the most they could hope for. And perhaps that's not so different from the human condition universally. We all know death wins eventually, but we fight for life anyway, finding meaning in the struggle itself rather than in any permanent victory. You're standing in the ruins of Tenochtitlan in 1521, and the city is burning. Spanish soldiers and their Tlaxcalan allies are systematically destroying the Templo Mayor, toppling the pyramid stone by stone, smashing the idols, scattering the offerings that took centuries to accumulate. Hernan Cortés watches from a distance, and in his mind he's justifying this destruction with the horrors he's witnessed, or claims to have witnessed. In the letters he'll write to King Charles V of Spain, He'll describe the Aztec capital as a place of unspeakable evil, where tens of thousands are sacrificed annually, where every temple drips with blood, where human flesh is sold in the markets like pork or beef. These accounts will shape European understanding of Aztec civilization for centuries, painting them as the most bloodthirsty people in history, monsters who needed to be conquered and converted for the salvation of their souls and the safety of their neighbours. But how much of what Cortés reported was accurate observation, and how much was propaganda designed to justify conquest and legitimize the seizure of an empire? The truth, as archaeology and careful scholarship are slowly revealing, is complicated and uncomfortable. The Aztecs really did practice human sacrifice on a massive scale, but the Spanish also systematically exaggerated and distorted these practices to serve their own political and religious agendas. Let's start with what the Spanish got right, or at least roughly correct. Human sacrifice was absolutely central to Aztec religious practice, occurring daily in Tenochtitlan and throughout the empire. Heart extraction happened on pyramid summits, exactly as the chronicles describe, with obsidian knives and priests trained in the technique. Skull racks displayed thousands of remains in geometric arrangements. Children were sacrificed to Tlaloc. Warriors were flayed and their skins worn by priests. The gladiator stone sacrifices occurred. The flower wars existed to capture prisoners specifically for ritual killing. Archaeological evidence has confirmed all these practices. The Spanish weren't inventing these rituals out of whole cloth. They witnessed them, they were horrified by them, and they recorded them. But the numbers are where things get complicated. Cortés and other conquistadors threw around figures that strain credibility. Bernal Díaz del Castillo claimed he personally counted 136,000 skulls on the main Tzompantli. Andrés de Tapia reported similar numbers. Chronicles describe the dedication of the expanded Templo Mayor in 1487 involving 80,400 sacrifices over 4 days, which would require killing more than one person every 5 seconds continuously for 96 hours straight. Even accounting for multiple priests working simultaneously, the logistics are nearly impossible. Modern scholars examining these claims have generally concluded they're gross exaggerations, perhaps inflated by factors of 10 or more. The real numbers were probably in the hundreds or low thousands for major festivals, which is still enormous but not the industrial-scale slaughter the Spanish described. Why exaggerate? The answer involves both honest perceptual errors and deliberate propaganda. First, the honest errors. The Spanish were genuinely shocked by what they saw, and shock distorts perception. When you witness something that violates your deepest moral categories, your brain struggles to process it accurately. Numbers become fuzzy. Scale seems larger than it is. The conquistadors were also trying to estimate things like skull counts without the ability to actually count each one. They'd see vast racks of skulls and make rough guesses that may have been sincere but wildly inaccurate. Diego Duran, one of the more careful chroniclers, admitted he couldn't actually count the skulls and was relying on estimates from others who also probably couldn't count them accurately. But beyond honest errors lay deliberate exaggeration. Cortés needed to justify his actions to the Spanish crown and to European public opinion. He'd conquered an enormous empire, destroyed its capital, killed thousands of people, and seized vast wealth, all without explicit royal permission to do so. He was essentially a rogue military commander who'd committed Spain to occupying a massive territory. To legitimize these actions, he needed to present the Aztecs as so depraved, so bloodthirsty, so evil, that conquest became a moral necessity rather than an opportunistic land grab. The more monstrous he made the Aztecs seem, the more justified his actions appeared. Here's the quirky detail that reveals the propaganda at work. Spanish accounts consistently emphasize the most shocking rituals, while downplaying or ignoring aspects of Aztec culture that would have made them seem sophisticated or sympathetic. They wrote extensively about heart extractions but barely mentioned the Aztecs' advanced mathematics, astronomy and engineering. They described skull racks in gory detail, but glossed over the elaborate poetry, the sophisticated legal system, the universal education system that meant Aztec commoners were often more literate than Spanish peasants. They emphasized cannibalism, which did occur in some ritual contexts, while ignoring the Aztecs' complex agricultural systems that fed a population larger than any European city of the time. The selective emphasis created a distorted picture that served Spanish interests. The cannibalism question deserves particular attention because it became central to European images of Aztec savagery. Spanish sources claim that sacrificial victims' bodies were butchered and distributed, with limbs given to the warriors who captured them, and that human flesh was eaten in ritual meals. Archaeological evidence and indigenous sources partially confirm this. Ritual cannibalism did occur in specific ceremonial contexts, but Spanish accounts suggest it was far more widespread than evidence supports, claiming human flesh was sold in markets and eaten regularly. Modern scholarly consensus holds that cannibalism was ritual and limited, not routine dietary practice. The Aztecs weren't eating people because they were hungry. They were consuming small amounts of sacrificial flesh in highly specific religious contexts where the flesh of a sacrifice victim was considered to carry divine essence. It's still disturbing, but it's qualitatively different from the casual anthropophagy the Spanish described. Historians still argue about Spanish motivations and the reliability of different chroniclers. Some, like Bernardino de Sahagún, made genuine efforts to understand Aztec culture and recorded indigenous perspectives. Sahagún's Florentine Codex was compiled with extensive input from Aztec informants who provided detailed descriptions in Nahuatl language, later translated. His account is generally considered more reliable, though still filtered through Spanish Catholic worldview. Others, like Diego Duran, showed ambivalence, simultaneously fascinated by and repulsed by what they documented. And some, like Cortés himself, were clearly interested in justifying conquest more than objective documentation. Mainstream historical fact, comparative analysis of multiple Spanish sources, indigenous language documents, and archaeological evidence allows modern scholars to separate probable truth from likely exaggeration. Recent excavations at the Templo Maya site have provided physical evidence confirming many ritual practices while also suggesting Spanish number estimates were inflated. Archaeologists estimate the main Tzompantli held thousands of skulls, not hundreds of thousands, and that major sacrificial events involved hundreds of victims, not tens of thousands. The indigenous perspective on the Spanish conquest adds crucial context often missing from European accounts. To the Aztecs, the Spanish were barbaric in their own ways. They destroyed sacred sites without permission from their gods. They refused to perform the bloodletting rituals that maintained cosmic order. They brought devastating diseases, smallpox, measles, typhus, that killed far more people than any Aztec sacrifice ever had. Within a century of contact, the indigenous population of central Mexico declined by roughly 90% due to European diseases. From the Aztec perspective, the Spanish were apocalyptic figures who brought death on a scale that made ritual sacrifice look trivial by comparison. The conversion efforts that followed conquest involved their own forms of violence that Spanish sources understandably downplayed. Indigenous people were forced to abandon their religious practices under threat of punishment or death. Temples were demolished. Codices were burned. Diego de Landa, a Franciscan friar in the Yucatan, boasted of burning thousands of Maya books, destroying most of the written record of Mesoamerican civilization. People caught practicing old rituals could be tortured or executed. The Spanish justified this religious violence by pointing to the horrors of human sacrifice. But from the indigenous perspective, one form of religiously motivated killing was being replaced by another. There's a deeply uncomfortable question we have to sit with. Would the Aztec Empire have eventually reformed its sacrificial practices without Spanish conquest? We can never know, of course, but it's worth considering that cultures do evolve, that practices considered necessary can be abandoned when circumstances change. The Aztecs had only been the dominant power in the Valley of Mexico for about 200 years when the Spanish arrived. Who knows what their civilization might have become given another century or two? The conquest froze them in historical amber at their moment of maximum imperial expansion and sacrificial practice, preventing us from ever knowing whether internal pressures, economic, political, theological, might have eventually reduced or transformed these rituals. The Spanish accounts also fail to capture the full complexity of Aztec attitudes toward their own practices. Indigenous sources suggest there were debates, doubts, and internal critics who questioned whether the gods really required so much blood. Some accounts describe priests or nobles expressing uncertainty about whether sacrifices actually accomplish their stated cosmic purposes. These voices were suppressed by the dominant religious establishment, much as religious dissenters in medieval Europe were suppressed, but their existence suggests the Aztec worldview wasn't monolithic. That space existed for questioning and critique, that not everyone accepted the sacrificial system uncritically. Do you remember learning about the cosmic worldview that justified all these sacrifices, the belief that the universe required constant feeding to prevent its collapse? The Spanish heard these explanations and concluded the Aztecs were delusional, trapped in false consciousness created by demonic deception. They never seriously considered whether their own religious worldview, centered on a god whose son was brutally executed to redeem humanity, might seem equally strange to an outside observer. Both systems involved sacred violence. Both claimed cosmic necessity. Both inspired devotion and demanded sacrifice. The Spanish could see the beam in the Aztec eye while missing the beam in their own. You're walking through modern Mexico City, and if you know where to look, you can still see traces of the world you've been exploring. The Metropolitan Cathedral sits directly atop the ruins of the Templo Mayor, built from stones torn from the pyramid itself. The Zocalo, the massive central plaza, occupies the exact location where the Aztec ceremonial precinct once stood, where thousands gathered to witness sacrifices and festivals. But something remarkable has happened over the centuries since conquest. The ancient rituals didn't simply disappear. They transformed, adapted, merged with Catholic practices, and survived in forms that continue to this day. The Danza de los Voladores still spins at tourist sites, now performed as cultural heritage rather than divine obligation. Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, creates elaborate altars to honor deceased relatives with flowers, food, and photographs, echoing Aztec beliefs about maintaining relationships with the dead. Indigenous communities throughout Mexico still perform ceremonies that blend pre-Columbian and Catholic elements so thoroughly that separating them becomes impossible. The twisted rituals you've witnessed throughout this journey haven't vanished. They've evolved. their DNA still present in Mexican culture 500 years after the empire fell. The Danza de los Voladores, the ceremony where men throw themselves from tall poles and spiral toward Earth, continues in several Mexican states, particularly Veracruz and Puebla. Modern performances occur at archaeological sites like El Tajín, where tourists gather to watch exactly what you witnessed in ancient Tenochtitlan. 5 men climbing a 30-meter pole, one dancing at the summit while 4 fly in descending circles. The theological context has changed. The performers aren't asking gods to maintain cosmic order or ensure agricultural abundance. They're preserving cultural heritage, entertaining visitors, maintaining traditions their ancestors practiced. But the physical movements remain identical. The mathematics, 4 flyers, 13 rotations each, 52 total revolutions, persist unchanged. The pole still represents the world tree connecting earth and sky. The ceremony's form survived even as its meaning transformed. Dia de los Muertos offers an even more fascinating example of ritual evolution. Modern celebrations occur on November 1st and 2nd, coinciding with the Catholic holy days of All Saints and All Souls. Families create elaborate ofrendas, altars in their homes decorated with marigold flowers, candles, photographs of deceased relatives, and the dead person's favourite foods and drinks. They visit cemeteries to clean graves, leave offerings, and spend time with the departed. Pan de Muerto, bread of the dead, is baked in shapes decorated with bone patterns. Sugar skulls with names written in icing appear in markets. The entire aesthetic embraces death with colour, sweetness, and celebration rather than sombre mourning. The roots in Aztec practice are unmistakable. The Aztecs believed the dead continued to exist in various afterlife realms depending on how they died, and that maintaining connections with deceased ancestors was essential. They made offerings at graves. They kept skulls of important ancestors in their homes. They believed certain times of year allowed easier communication between the living and dead. When Spanish missionaries arrived and tried to eliminate these pagan practices, indigenous people adapted by mapping their beliefs onto Catholic festivals. All Saints' Day became the day to honour dead children. All Souls' Day honoured dead adults. The timing aligned closely enough with Aztec festivals for the dead that the transition was relatively seamless. What emerged was neither purely indigenous nor purely Catholic, but a hybrid that satisfied both traditions while fully embodying neither. Here's the quirky detail that shows how thoroughly ancient and modern have merged. Many Mexican families today would be surprised to learn how much pre-Columbian theology survives in their Day of the Dead practices. They consider it a Catholic tradition, perhaps with some indigenous flavour. But the core belief that death doesn't sever relationships, that the dead can return to visit during specific times, that offerings of food and flowers nourish the departed, comes directly from Aztec cosmology. The Catholic veneer is real but thin. Beneath it, ancient patterns persist. Bloodletting, obviously, has not survived in any overt form. You won't find Mexicans piercing their tongues with maguey thorns during religious ceremonies, at least not in mainstream practice, but the concept of sacrifice, of giving something precious to demonstrate devotion, persists in transformed ways. Pilgrims walk for days or crawl on their knees to reach sacred sites like the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe. Penitents during Holy Week carry heavy crosses or engage in self-flagellation. The specific forms have changed, but the underlying principle, that devotion requires physical sacrifice, that the body must suffer to demonstrate spiritual commitment, echoes through the centuries from Aztec temples to Catholic churches. Human sacrifice, for obvious reasons, ended completely after conquest. No rituals practicing literal heart extraction or anything similar survived into modern times. But the theological concepts that justified those sacrifices, that death can be meaningful, that individual lives might be offered for communal benefit, that cosmic forces require maintenance through human action, those ideas never fully disappeared. They transformed into concepts like martyrdom, self-sacrifice for family or nation, the willing acceptance of suffering for higher purposes. The forms are completely different, the contexts unrecognizable, but certain patterns in how humans think about death and meaning and cosmic order persist across cultural transformations. Historians still argue about whether these continuities represent genuine cultural survival or coincidental similarities. Some scholars emphasize the rupture of conquest, arguing that modern Mexican culture is fundamentally post-Columbian with only superficial indigenous elements. Others stress continuity, seeing indigenous worldviews persisting beneath Catholic and European overlays. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Some practices genuinely survive through intentional preservation or unconscious transmission, while others were reinvented or reimagined based on partial knowledge of the past. The archaeological rediscovery of Aztec civilization has itself become a kind of ritual for modern Mexico. When electrical workers uncovered part of the Templo Mayor in 1978, it sparked a massive excavation project that continues today. The site is now a museum where visitors can walk through the ruins, see the offering caches exactly as archaeologists found them, and confront the physical reality of the culture that once dominated this valley. School groups tour the site, learning about their pre-Columbian heritage. Tourists from around the world come to witness the stones and bones and objects that survived 5 centuries of burial. The site has become sacred again, not for religious reasons, but for historical and cultural ones. A place where modern Mexicans connect with their indigenous ancestors, and foreigners confront a civilization that challenges their assumptions about history and humanity. Mainstream historical fact: the Templo Mayor Museum, opened in 1987, displays over 7,000 objects recovered from the archaeological site. Annual visitor numbers exceed 650,000 people. The site has become one of Mexico City's most important cultural institutions, featured in educational curricula and national identity narratives. Modern Mexico officially embraces its indigenous heritage, including the Aztec Empire, as foundational to national culture despite the traumatic history of conquest. The question of how modern Mexicans relate to Aztec sacrifice is complex and varies by individual. Some feel pride in the sophistication of Aztec civilization, while feeling uncomfortable with the sacrificial practices. Others emphasize context, arguing the Aztecs shouldn't be judged by modern standards. Still others point out that all civilizations have violent histories, and Spanish conquest involved its own massive violence that killed far more people than Aztec sacrifice ever did. There's no single Mexican perspective. Opinions range across a spectrum from rejection to embrace, to ambivalent acceptance of complexity. What's undeniable is that the twisted rituals you've explored throughout this journey, the heart extractions and skull racks, the crying children and flayed skins, the gladiator stones and flower wars, continue to fascinate and disturb people worldwide. The Aztecs challenge our comfortable narratives about human progress and civilization. They were sophisticated. Their capital was cleaner and better organized than any European city of the time. Their mathematics and astronomy were advanced. Their art was breathtaking. and they practiced human sacrifice on a scale that horrifies modern sensibilities. Both things are true simultaneously. They force us to confront uncomfortable questions about what civilization means, whether technological advancement correlates with moral advancement, and how future societies might judge our own practices that we consider normal. Do you remember standing in the darkness during the new fire ceremony, feeling the collective terror that the sun might not return? That moment, 500 years ago, contained genuine human emotion, authentic fear and hope and relief. The people who experienced it weren't monsters or primitives. They were humans trying to make sense of existence, to maintain order, to ensure their children's survival. They used tools and concepts available within their worldview, just as we use tools and concepts available within ours. Their rituals strike us as twisted because our worldview has changed so dramatically. But some future civilization might look back at our practices, the weapons we build, the resources we waste, the inequalities we tolerate, and find them equally twisted, equally incomprehensible. The legacy of Aztec ritual practice is ultimately about the plasticity of human culture and belief. People can be socialized to accept almost anything as normal, necessary, even sacred. The Aztecs created a civilization where watching hearths extracted on pyramid summits was unremarkable, where children playing near skull racks was everyday life, where walking past priests wearing human skin was just another day in the city. This should humble us. It should make us question what we consider normal and necessary. It should remind us that our own certainties about what's moral, what's civilized, what's acceptable, are culturally constructed and historically contingent. And yet, despite everything you've witnessed, despite the blood and bones and twisted ceremonies, there's something almost beautiful about the Aztec commitment to their worldview. They genuinely believed they were maintaining the universe, feeding the cosmic machinery, ensuring existence continued. They sacrificed not because they were evil, but because they were devoted. They built pyramids and skull racks and ceremonial centers because they cared deeply about cosmic order. Their rituals were acts of love. Love for the gods, love for the sun, love for existence itself, even though those acts took forms we find horrifying. Perhaps that's the most unsettling realization of all. The capacity for profound devotion and terrible violence don't exist in different people. They can exist in the same hearts, the same culture, the same ritual system. The Aztecs weren't uniquely twisted. They were uniquely human, showing us possibilities within human nature that we'd prefer not to acknowledge, but cannot honestly deny. The sun rises over Mexico City tomorrow morning, just as it rose over Tenochtitlan 500 years ago. No hearts will be extracted to fuel its journey across the sky. No children will cry themselves toward drowning. No warriors will fight impossible odds on gladiator stones. The fifth sun continues without the blood offerings the Aztecs believed were absolutely necessary. And yet, the Aztecs were right about something fundamental. Life does require death. Not in the cosmic sense they imagined, but in the ecological sense we now understand. Every meal you eat, every breath you take, every moment you exist is built on countless deaths. Plants and animals consumed, microorganisms destroyed, resources extracted from the earth. We've found ways to distance ourselves from this reality, to sanitize death and hide it behind supermarket packaging and hospital curtains. The Aztecs made death visible, public, sacred. They were wrong about the specific mechanisms, but right about the basic equation. Existence is not free. Life feeds on life. Death is not the opposite of life, but its necessary partner. And perhaps that's the final lesson from the twisted rituals of the Aztec Empire. Not that they were monsters, but that they were brave enough to look directly at truths the rest of us prefer to hide. The pyramids of Tenochtitlan are gone now, torn down stone by stone and buried beneath centuries of colonial and modern construction. But if you stand in the Zocalo at dawn, when the city is quiet and the light is soft, you can almost feel them, those ancient structures, those sacred spaces where countless lives ended and countless beliefs were maintained. The blood has long since washed away, the bones have turned to dust, the gods have fallen silent. But the questions remain, hanging in the air like morning mist over the lake that no longer exists. What would you sacrifice for the sun to rise? What violence would you accept as necessary? What twisted rituals might our descendants find in our own civilization 500 years from now, when they look back at us with the same mixture of fascination and horror we've directed toward the Aztecs? The story you've travelled through tonight is finished, but its echoes continue. In every skull mask worn during Day of the Dead celebrations, in every archaeological discovery that reveals new details about life in ancient Tenochtitlan, in every uncomfortable realization that humans are capable of both extraordinary sophistication and extraordinary violence, often within the same culture, sometimes within the same moment. The Aztecs are gone, but they're not gone. They live on in questions we're still trying to answer, in mirrors that reflect aspects of ourselves we'd rather not see, in twisted rituals that remind us that civilization is always more fragile, stranger, and more complex than we imagine. Rest now. Let these images fade into dreams where pyramids and skull racks become abstract geometries, where the blood transforms into rivers of light, where the crying children find comfort, where the warriors rest from their eternal battles. The fifth sun rose again this morning, and it will rise tomorrow, not because of sacrifice, but because physics and astronomy guarantee it. And yet, the Aztecs would say that's exactly what they were doing, maintaining physics and astronomy through their offerings. Perhaps they weren't so different from us after all. Perhaps we're all just doing our best to make sense of existence, using whatever tools our moment in history provides, hoping our efforts matter, fearing they might not, carrying on anyway because that's what it means to be human. Sleep well. The universe continues, the sun will rise, and you've survived a journey through the most twisted rituals of an empire that believed it was saving the world, one beating heart at a time.